We continue with part 2 of the book Wiseguy by Nicholas Pileggi. Before we begin, don't forget to like and subscribe. Chapter 12. Henry's Florida Disaster. Henry always felt that his 10-year federal sentence was unbelievably bad luck after years of serious crimes. It wasn't one of his biggest crimes that finally put him away. It was a violent incident in a Florida bar involving a man whose sister happened to work as an FBI typist. The whole thing began as an innocent-looking trip to Florida. Henry traveled with Jimmy Burke and Casey Rosado, who was going to Tampa, to collect gambling money that someone owed him. They went to a Cuban restaurant in Ybor City before heading to the Temple Terrace Lounge, where Casey planned to confront John Ciaccio. Before entering the bar, Casey's cousin unexpectedly handed Henry an old .38 revolver. Henry thought little of it and slipped it into his jacket. Inside, Casey and Ciaccio began arguing. Suddenly, the argument turned violent. Jimmy grabbed Ciaccio by the tie and threatened him while Henry stood nearby holding the gun. They forced Ciaccio into their car and demanded the money he owed Casey. Ciaccio refused at first, insisting they would have to kill him before he paid. Henry hit him several times with the gun until he finally agreed to cooperate. They discovered that Ciaccio claimed he owed only half the money, while the other half belonged to a doctor involved in the gambling debt. They eventually took Ciaccio to a bar owned by Casey's cousin. Because he was bleeding badly, they covered his head with his jacket and hid him in a storage room while Casey contacted the doctor. After several hours, the money was finally collected, and Ciaccio was handed over to his brother. Henry thought the matter was finished. He was completely wrong. About a month later, Henry heard on the radio that the FBI was looking for Jimmy Burke and others. At first, he had no idea why. Then he discovered that the authorities were investigating what happened in Florida. The reason shocked him. Ciaccio's sister worked as a typist at the FBI. After seeing her injured brother, she became terrified that her entire family might be attacked. When she returned to work, she broke down in tears in front of FBI agents and told them everything she knew: the gambling, the bars, the doctor, her brother's associates, and eventually Henry and the others. The FBI suddenly had what they believed was a major organized crime case. The men were first charged by Florida with kidnapping and attempted murder. Casey Rosado testified and convinced the jury that Ciaccio was lying, allowing them to defeat the state case. But federal prosecutors were not finished. They charged the group with extortion. Then, just before the federal trial, disaster struck again. Casey Rosado suddenly died of a heart attack at the age of 46. Henry knew immediately that their best chance of winning had disappeared with Casey. Without him, there was no one left who could take the stand and defend them effectively. The trial lasted 12 days. On November 3rd, 1972, the jury returned after only 6 hours. Guilty. The verdict was unanimous. Henry, who had spent his life escaping much more serious crimes, finally found himself facing 10 years in a federal penitentiary, all because a violent barroom incident in Florida had unexpectedly turned into a major federal case. Chapter 13. Henry's Last Days of Freedom. When Henry received his 10-year sentence, the news devastated Karen. She considered moving back in with her parents, taking her own life, killing Henry, and even divorcing him. She was terrified about how she would survive and support the children while Henry was in prison. But Henry didn't go to prison immediately. His lawyers filed appeals, giving him almost 2 years of freedom before he finally had to surrender. Instead of slowing down, Henry became more deeply involved in crime. He borrowed money from loan sharks without intending to repay them, moved stolen goods, dealt in stolen cars and counterfeit credit cards, and expanded his criminal operations. He also became involved in arson and began buying large quantities of sterno for his work. As his prison date approached, Henry practically stripped the sweet bear. He sold the liquor and equipment, ran up debts, and eventually even burglarized his own bar. When the IRS later came to auction the property, almost everything had vanished. The day before surrendering, Henry took Linda to the Empire State Building. He told her that he was going away and that she should move on with her life. He admitted that if he had enough money, he would take her to Brazil, but he didn't. They cried, kissed goodbye, and separated. Meanwhile, Henry carefully prepared for prison. He used his connections to learn how the federal prison system worked and arranged to be sent to Lewisburg Federal Penitentiary in Pennsylvania. He believed it would be one of the easier places for him because it was close to New York, had corrupt officials, and housed several organized crime figures he already knew. He also studied the prison rules and discovered ways to reduce his sentence. Good behavior, work, education, and other prison programs could take time off his 10-year sentence. On paper, his 10 years could potentially become much less. Eventually, Henry estimated that he might actually spend only 3 or 4 years behind bars. The night before he was supposed to surrender, his friends threw him a huge farewell party at Rogers Place, a restaurant Henry had opened to help support Karen and the children. The celebration continued through the night and into the next morning. With only hours left before he had to report to the authorities, Henry and his friends went to Maxwell's Plum for what was supposed to be his last drink as a free man. Instead, the drinking turned into another party. As the afternoon passed, one woman even suggested that Henry escape to Canada. She offered him a place to stay and encouraged him not to surrender. But then Karen called. Henry learned that the authorities were threatening to revoke his $50,000 appeal bond and declare him a fugitive. His bondsman could lose the entire amount, and Karen was already terrified about supporting herself and the children. That finally made Henry realize that running would only create even bigger problems. He drank one last glass, took some Valium, said goodbye to his friends, and ordered the limousine driver to take him to jail. When Henry finally arrived at Lewisburg Federal Penitentiary, everything changed. The prison stood behind enormous walls, steel gates, guard towers, and searchlights in the cold, rainy hills of Pennsylvania. Henry and the other prisoners had been handcuffed and shackled throughout the journey from New York. As the massive steel gates opened, Henry saw concrete iron bars everywhere. Then the enormous steel wall closed behind him. For the first time in his life, Henry understood the difference between jail and prison. Jail had always been temporary, a few weeks or months that he could treat almost like an inconvenience. This was different. He was no longer simply waiting to get out. He had entered a real federal prison, and for the first time, the freedom he had taken for granted was truly gone. When Henry's prison bus finally stopped inside Lewisburg, the guards immediately made it clear that he was no longer a free man. They shouted at the prisoners, reminding them that they were in prison, not on vacation. Henry stepped off the bus freezing in his thin army fatigues. Armed guards surrounded the prisoners as they were taken through a cold, damp concrete tunnel into the reception area. There, Henry was given the basic prison supplies: a thin mattress, a sheet, a blanket, a pillow, a towel, and a few personal items. But then Henry looked up and saw something he never expected. Paulie was standing there laughing. Beside him were Johnny Dio and Fat Andy Ruggiero. Instead of treating Henry like a new prisoner, they welcomed him like an old friend. They hugged him, took control of his belongings, and arranged for him to get a private cell while he completed his initial orientation. When Henry entered the main reception room, even more familiar faces were waiting for him. A dozen mob-connected inmates clapped, laughed, and shouted greetings. It was almost like Henry had arrived at a party instead of federal penitentiary. Henry quickly discovered that prison life was very different for the Wiseguys. While ordinary prisoners lived under harsh conditions, organized crime inmates had created their own privileged world. They kept themselves separated from the general population and used money and influence to make their lives more comfortable. After 2 months, Henry managed to get into the honor dorm, where Paulie, Johnny Dio, and other powerful mob figures lived. A small payment was enough to secure his place. The honor dorm barely looked like a prison. It was a separate 3-story building with comfortable beds, private bathrooms, and rooms filled with organized crime figures. Henry described it as almost like a mob convention. Inside, the rules were routinely ignored. The inmates secretly kept alcohol, cooked their own food, and received steaks, seafood, wine, and liquor through corrupt prison guards. Some guards were paid to smuggle supplies into the prison, while others simply looked the other way. Henry was even put in charge of the group's cash. They kept thousands of dollars hidden in their rooms and spent hundreds of dollars every week on food and alcohol. The prison had become a strange world where money and connections could buy comfort. Henry's family also remained part of his prison life. Karen visited him almost every weekend with the children and, like other wives, helped bring food and wine into the visiting area. Once inside the visiting room, the families would push tables together and turn their visits into something resembling a family party. For Henry, prison was supposed to mean losing his freedom. Instead, thanks to his connections, money, and the organized crime network inside Lewisburg, he discovered that even behind prison walls, the Wiseguys had their own rules and their own way of living. Henry gradually settled into prison life. His days were filled with work, school, rehabilitation programs, meals, and recreation. Most prisoners worked because having a job could shorten their sentences and improve their chances with the parole board. The Wiseguys, however, had created their own world inside Lewisburg. Paulie had an official job changing the music tapes on the prison's public address system, although someone else actually did the work for him. His real passion was building stoves. He secretly obtained heating elements in metal boxes and turned them into working hot plates for the inmates to use in their dorms. Dinner became the highlight of the day. The mobsters would gather together, drink, play cards, and cook elaborate meals. Paulie prepared the garlic, Vinny Alloy made the tomato sauce, and Johnny Dio handled the meat. Despite the prison rules, they managed to create meals that felt more like dinners back home than prison food. Henry also decided to use his time to educate himself. He enrolled in a 2-year college program in restaurant and hotel management. Because he was a veteran, he received monthly benefits, which he sent home to Karen. More importantly, Henry discovered a genuine hunger for learning. He had left school as a child and could barely read properly. Now, after the prison doors were locked at night, he would sit alone and read. He went through 2 or 3 books every week. Henry also discovered a new passion, tennis. He helped maintain the prison's tennis courts and eventually became a regular player. Even some of the older Wiseguys became interested, turning the prison courts into another place where the inmates gathered. But Henry didn't stop his criminal activities just because he was behind bars. With Paulie introducing him to people, Henry began running a betting operation inside the prison. Prisoners and even guards placed bets with him. His customers included former politicians and other inmates. Karen became an important part of the operation from outside. She collected money and handled payment for Henry. Instead of keeping large amounts of cash inside the prison, Henry arranged for prisoners' families and friends to settle their debts outside. The gambling gave Henry something to do, brought him money, and helped to maintain good relationships with the guards. After 2.5 years, Henry finally achieved something he had wanted for a long time, a transfer to Prison Farm, located about 1.5 miles outside the main prison walls. The move came at a dangerous time. Lewisburg had become extremely violent, with a prison riot resulting in 9 murders in just 3 months. Tensions were so high that prisoners, including the Wiseguys, refused to leave their cells for work. The guards eventually removed the organized crime inmates from the honor dorm and placed them in solitary confinement for their own protection. For Henry, the prison farm offered something he desperately wanted after years behind concrete walls: a little more freedom and a chance to breathe outside the main prison. Karen refused to accept Henry's situation. She began a relentless letter-writing campaign to the Bureau of Prisons in Washington, asking that Henry be transferred to the prison farm. Instead of writing only to local prison officials, Karen contacted people with influence: congressmen, lawyers, businessmen, clergymen, and family members. Whenever a congressman wrote to the Bureau of Prisons, the request was forwarded to Lewisburg, forcing prison officials to take notice of Henry's case. Karen kept detailed records of every letter and phone call. She followed up repeatedly and even maintained contact with bureaucrats after they were promoted or transferred. Eventually, her persistence, Henry's excellent prison record, and changes within the prison following the riot helped him secure the transfer. The prison farm was almost like freedom. It was a 200-acre working dairy that supplied milk to the prison. Henry and a few other prisoners were responsible for milking about 65 cows and transporting the milk to Lewisburg and another nearby federal facility. His work started early in the morning, but once the morning milking was finished, Henry was essentially free until the afternoon milking. He could move around the farm with very little supervision, and Henry immediately saw an opportunity. The man in charge of the dairy, Sauer, was a gambler. Henry began giving him money to bet at the racetrack. In return, Sauer gradually became dependent on Henry's money and started bringing him food, cigarettes, and alcohol. Henry realized that the farm's weak security could allow him to bring almost anything inside. His job checking the perimeter gave him access to a tractor and wire cutters, and he could disappear around the farm for hours. Soon, he was using the farm as a smuggling operation. Karen began visiting him secretly in the fields. Henry also figured out how to hide food and alcohol inside milk containers that were being transported into the prison. Before long, drugs were coming in too. Henry arranged for marijuana and pills to be brought into the prison and hidden around the farm. He stored supplies in buried milk containers and other hiding places. He even managed to get a pistol onto the farm. But despite all of this criminal activity, Henry worked extremely hard. He was often working 18 hours a day, especially when cows were giving birth or equipment needed repairs. Even the guards considered him one of the hardest working farmhands there. At the same time, Henry formed partnerships with other inmates. Paul Motzi helped supply marijuana and pills from outside sources, while Bill Arrico handled much of the selling inside Lewisburg. The operation quickly grew. Arrico became one of the prison's biggest drug suppliers, selling roughly a pound of marijuana every week and earning hundreds of dollars from it. Other prisoners sold pills and LSD as well. Henry had discovered something remarkable. Inside Lewisburg, prison wasn't just a place to serve time. It was a marketplace, and with the freedom of the prison farm, Henry had found a way to turn the prison itself into another criminal business. Henry's criminal operation inside Lewisburg continued to grow, but he became especially careful with cocaine. Unlike marijuana, he refused to trust anyone else with it and personally handled its transportation. He developed a clever way to move marijuana into the prison. He compressed the drugs into small packages, hid them inside handballs, and threw them over the prison wall onto the handball court. Before doing so, he would contact an accomplice in the prison hospital, who would alert the distributors waiting nearby. This allowed Henry to move large quantities of marijuana with surprisingly few packages. But there was one major problem: Johnny Dio. Johnny didn't object to drugs because of morality. He simply feared that drug dealing would bring unwanted attention from prison authorities and make life harder for everyone. Henry, however, needed money. Johnny wasn't going to financially support him, so Henry believed he had no choice but to continue selling drugs secretly. Eventually, the secret operation caused a serious problem. One of Henry's distributors was caught storing drugs in a safe inside the priest's office. Johnny Dio regularly used that office to meet lawyers and make phone calls, so when the authorities discovered the drugs, the place became off-limits. Johnny was furious. Henry realized that his own life could now be in danger. He needed Paulie's help to convince Johnny not to have him killed. When Paulie confronted Henry and asked directly whether he was selling drugs, Henry simply lied. He denied everything. Paulie believed him. Henry knew that if the truth came out, the consequences could be much more serious than losing his prison business. Chapter 14. Karen's Struggle. For nearly 2 years, Karen visited Henry in prison every week. But eventually the visits became less frequent because the journey was exhausting, especially for the children. The trip took around 6 hours each way, and the prison visiting room was cold, uncomfortable, and boring. Henry's daughter Judy even developed severe stomach pains whenever they visited. After 2 years, she finally admitted that the prison bathrooms were so filthy that she refused to use them during extremely long visits. Meanwhile, Karen was struggling financially. When Henry went to prison, the money suddenly disappeared. She worked part-time as a dental technician and learned how to groom dogs, so she could earn money while staying home with the children. The people who owed Henry money rarely paid, despite the fact that he had helped many of them when he was running the suite. Karen eventually realized that the criminal world Henry belonged to wasn't the loyal family she had imagined. People helped each other when it benefited them, but when Henry was gone, almost nobody helped Karen and the children. She sold some stolen fixtures from the suite to one of Henry's associates, but even he took the equipment and never paid her. Life became expensive because Henry needed money inside prison. He was spending hundreds of dollars every week on food, supplies, and payments to guards. The $673 monthly veterans benefit Henry received for attending school was sent home to Karen, and later he began sending her money earned through his prison operations. Karen and the children lived in an apartment in Valley Stream, but spent much of their time at her parents' house. Henry called them every night, especially to speak with the girls. The children knew their father was in prison, but Karen carefully protected them from the truth. When they were young, she simply told them that Henry had broken the law but hadn't hurt anyone. She even told them that he had been caught playing cards, because the girls already understood that gambling was against the law. The girls also knew that Henry and his friends gambled and that some things in their home had been stolen, but they didn't understand the larger criminal world surrounding their father. To them, people like Jimmy and Polly were simply generous family friends who arrived at parties and birthdays carrying presents. Karen noticed an important difference between Henry and some of his friends. Henry never bragged about his crimes in front of his children. One day, Ruth came home shocked after visiting Jimmy's family because Jimmy's son openly cheered for criminals and hated the police while watching television. Karen was relieved that her own children weren't being raised to admire criminals. But Karen herself was becoming deeply involved in Henry's prison life. Her mother couldn't understand why Karen went to the prison so often or why she constantly prepared bags filled with food, soap, cigarettes, shaving supplies, and other necessities. What her mother didn't know was that Karen was helping Henry smuggle things into the prison. At first, she brought ordinary supplies, special olive oil, imported sausages, cigarettes, and alcohol. But eventually the packages became much more dangerous. Henry arranged for suppliers to deliver drugs to Karen's house, and she began taking marijuana, hashish, cocaine, amphetamines, and quaaludes into the prison during her visits. What started as a wife trying to support her imprisoned husband had gradually turned Karen into an active participant in Henry's criminal operation behind the prison walls. Karen's prison visits became much more than ordinary family visits. She had begun smuggling food, alcohol, and drugs into Lewisburg for Henry to get through security. She had food under her clothes and used oversized clothing and specially purchased boots to conceal bottles. She even used a large bra and leg garments to carry drugs and pills. The guards searched bags and used metal detectors, but the security was surprisingly weak. Once Karen reached the visiting room, she could take everything into the bathroom, remove the hidden packages, and bring them to Henry and the children. The visiting room was filled with food brought by prisoners' families, so the guards rarely questioned what was on the tables. Karen also discovered that many of the guards were being paid to look the other way. For Karen, the operation became almost routine. She would wake her daughters at 3 a.m, pack their belongings, and drive for roughly 6 hours to Lewisburg. She tried to arrive early enough to spend the entire visiting day with Henry, but there were always dozens of families waiting ahead of her. The visiting days resembled enormous family picnics. Wives brought homemade food, children photographs, and other things to make the prison visit feel as normal as possible. Then, in December 1976, Henry was transferred to the prison farm. For Karen, this changed everything. The farm gave Henry much greater freedom and made it easier for Karen to bring him supplies. Henry could claim that he was checking the fence, then secretly meet Karen away from the main prison. Karen began arriving with duffel bags filled with food, whiskey, and drugs. Another prisoner's wife would drop her off on a dark dirt road near the farm. She had to wait until it was completely dark because a guard who lived nearby watched the area with binoculars. The first time Karen attempted the secret meeting, she stood alone in the darkness, terrified. Minutes felt like hours. Then suddenly, a hand grabbed her arm. She nearly jumped out of her skin. It was Henry, dressed completely in black. He took the bags, handed one to another prisoner, and led Karen into the woods. He had brought a bottle of wine and a blanket. For the first time in 2.5 years, Karen was finally alone with her husband, and despite the fear, the darkness, and everything they had done to get there, the two of them were together again. When Henry first arrived at Lewisburg, he was frustrated with Karen. During visits, she constantly complained about money and about the people who still owed Henry money from the suite. She couldn't understand why his old friends were driving expensive cars, while she was struggling to make ends meet by grooming dogs. Henry saw things differently. To him, once a Wiseguy went to prison, the money stopped. Former partners and debtors didn't feel obligated to pay his wife. If Henry wanted money, he had to make it himself inside prison. For about 2 years, Henry earned $1,000 to $1,500 a month selling alcohol and marijuana that Karen helped smuggle inside. After moving to the prison farm, his operation expanded because he could meet Karen outside the main prison walls and receive much larger deliveries. But Henry wasn't becoming rich. Most of his money went to Karen, guards, and prison officials who protected his operation. In exchange, he was allowed to live an unusually comfortable life. He had good food, chosen roommates, access to phones, freedom to move around the farm, and very little supervision. Sometimes he and Karen could even have private picnics in the woods, or secretly disappear to a nearby hotel. Still, Henry remained a prisoner. Then, in August 1977, he heard about an opportunity that could completely change his situation. Nearby at Allenwood Correctional Facility, G. Gordon Liddy had organized a food strike involving dozens of prisoners. Henry heard that the Bureau of Prisons planned to transfer the protesters, which would leave empty spaces at Allenwood. Henry immediately wanted one of those spaces. To him, Allenwood was almost a country club of the federal prison system. There were no traditional prison walls or cells, and inmates had access to tennis courts, a gym, jogging tracks, a golf course, and liberal rehabilitation programs. Henry told Karen to start calling her contacts in Washington. He wanted her to make phone calls rather than simply send letters. He also tried to arrange for Jimmy Burke to get transferred there. But Henry's name wasn't on the transfer list. Some officials claimed it was because his file was marked organized crime. Others blamed an injury to his wrist. Karen made numerous calls to Washington, but nothing worked. Finally, Henry turned to someone he had quietly cultivated over the years, the secretary to his counselor. Henry had always treated her kindly, bringing her flowers, cooking food for her, and joking with her while she watched him play tennis. Now, he needed her help. One evening, while the final transfers were being arranged, she secretly changed the list. Henry's name went on. Within days, Henry arrived at Allenwood and immediately realized he had entered another world. There were large dormitories instead of traditional cells, with private cubicles for prisoners. Guards were barely visible. Apart from 2 daily roll calls, much of the facility operated on an honor system. Within a week, Henry was even allowed to travel to a hospital by himself without guards. The inmates also lived remarkably comfortable lives. Some continued running businesses from their dormitories, making phone calls and conducting deals. Wealthy prisoners received frequent visitors, sometimes arriving in limousines with personal staff and elaborate meals. Families could spend almost an entire day visiting, and there was even a daycare center for children. Henry immediately began looking for another advantage. Allenwood had a large Jewish population, and the prisoners had recently been granted a separate kosher kitchen. Henry volunteered to work there. His real goal was strategic. He wanted to establish himself as a religious prisoner so he could qualify for religious furloughs. If successful, those furloughs could eventually give him 7 days at home every 3 months. Once again, Henry wasn't simply serving his sentence. He was figuring out how to turn the prison system to his advantage. Once Henry discovered how easy it was to obtain religious furloughs at Allenwood, he began looking for ways to spend even more time outside prison. He had Karen contact a rabbi they knew, who wrote to prison officials requesting that Henry be allowed to leave once a month for religious instruction. The request was approved. But Henry quickly discovered that the religious weekends could be turned into something very different. A local rabbi picked Henry up on Friday afternoons, and instead of attending religious classes, they would drive to Atlantic City, where Henry met Karen and his old associates. They spent the weekends gambling, drinking, and partying. Henry paid the rabbi generously for arranging the trips. Eventually, he even managed to get Jimmy Burke included in the same religious weekends, giving the 2 old friends a chance to escape together like they had in the past. Henry didn't stop there. He joined the Junior Chamber of Commerce, which provided 5-day rehabilitation furloughs. He also participated in programs involving business seminars and community activities. Before long, Henry had figured out which people were willing to accept money in exchange for looking the other way. He combined religious holidays, furlough seminars, and other approved absences so effectively that at one point he joked that the prison owed him a day. Even when he wasn't officially allowed to leave, Henry found another solution. He could pay a guard $50 to let him leave the facility after the evening prisoner count and return before the morning count. Henry would arrange for Karen to stay at a nearby motel, often choosing places with indoor swimming pools. During longer furloughs, Henry simply went home. He would meet Karen or members of his crew near the official seminar location, and instead of returning to prison afterward, he would head straight home. He was getting out so often that some people in his neighborhood actually believed he had already been released. Then on July 12, 1978, Henry officially received early parole. According to the Bureau of Prisons, Henry was practically a model prisoner. His record showed excellent conduct, participation in education and rehabilitation programs, religious involvement, community service, cooperation with prison staff, and strong family relationships. He even had a job waiting for him near his home that supposedly paid $225 a week. The prison officials believed they had successfully rehabilitated Henry Hill. They had no idea what had really happened. They didn't know that Henry had spent years manipulating the prison's rules, bribing guards, abusing furlough programs, smuggling drugs, gambling, and secretly returning home. They also didn't know that his new job was essentially a no-show position arranged through his mob connections. His supposed employer was a mob-controlled nightclub and rock promoter who had previously hired Henry to burn buildings. Yet, on paper, everything looked perfect. Henry walked out of Allenwood as a model prisoner, with the Bureau of Prisons concluding that his chances of returning to prison were extremely low. The irony was obvious. The system believed it had rehabilitated Henry Hill, when in reality, Henry had simply learned how to manipulate the system. Chapter 15. Henry returns to the streets. On July 12, 1978, Henry Hill finally walked out of Allenwood a free man. He had only $78 in his pocket, an old suit, and an aging Buick waiting for him. Karen and the children were still living in a poor apartment, but Henry immediately told Karen to start looking for a house. After 4 years in prison, Henry had no intention of living an honest life. During his furloughs, he had already been planning ways to make money. To Henry, prison had not changed his ambitions. It had simply delayed them. Within 24 hours of his release, Henry violated his parole and flew to Pittsburgh to collect $15,000 from his marijuana partnership with Paul Motze. But Motze had already spent most of the money on a large supply of Colombian marijuana. He could only give Henry $2,000. Henry needed cash immediately, so he made a risky decision. He filled a large suitcase with marijuana and took it back to New York. Because he was afraid of having the suitcase searched at an airport, Henry traveled by Greyhound bus. The journey took more than 12 hours, and at every stop, he worried that someone might steal the suitcase. The problem was that Henry didn't even know how to sell marijuana on the street. He had never dealt drugs before prison, and his own crew was forbidden from selling them. After a week of searching, Henry finally found a buyer. The suitcase earned him $12,000 in cash. Henry used part of the money to buy his daughter Ruth a $200 porcelain doll for her birthday. Then he called Motze and ordered another 100 pounds of marijuana. That was the beginning of Henry's new criminal empire. Within a month, he was dealing in amphetamines, quaaludes, cocaine, and eventually heroin. He built his own crew, bringing in criminals, couriers, and people who could help distribute the drugs. But drugs weren't his only business. Henry also became involved in weapons and stolen jewelry. He obtained guns through a contact connected to a Connecticut armory and supplied them to his criminal associates. He also began fencing expensive stolen jewelry through a New York diamond dealer. One major source was William Arrico, whose robbery crew targeted wealthy people and luxury hotels. One of their biggest robberies involved Estee Lauder, whose Manhattan townhouse was robbed of more than $1 million in jewelry. Henry's job was to help turn the stolen jewels into cash. At the same time, Henry was trying to establish himself in the liquor distribution business, hoping to supply bars and restaurants controlled by Jimmy Burke and Paul Vario. And he maintained his fake legitimate life as well. Henry continued collecting his $225 weekly paycheck from his no-show job as a disco manager. The paycheck was important because he needed proof of employment for his parole officer. Then Henry's criminal activities took an even more serious turn. During a trip to Pittsburgh, he met Tony Perla, a bookmaker who introduced him to a plan involving college basketball. Perla claimed that he had recruited a Boston College basketball player named Rick Kuhn, who was willing to manipulate games for money. Kuhn could bring in his close friend and team captain, Jim Sweeney, and possibly another player. The plan wasn't necessarily to lose games outright. Instead, the players would manipulate the point spread. If Boston College was favored to win by 10 points, for example, the players would make sure they won by fewer than 10. The team would still win the game, but the gamblers betting against the spread would win their bets. The players could therefore claim they weren't deliberately losing games. They were simply controlling how much they won by. Perla believed Henry was essential because of his connections to the mob and bookmakers. Henry could help place large bets across different bookmakers and provide protection if anyone became suspicious. Henry had spent years learning how to manipulate systems. Now, only days after leaving prison, he was back on the streets building a criminal operation that was larger and more ambitious than anything he had run before. Henry realized that the basketball scheme would require a large network of bookmakers. He planned to spread the bets among 15 or 20 bookmakers, letting only a few trusted people know what was really happening. When Henry returned to New York and told Jimmy Burke and Paul Vario about the plan, they loved it. Jimmy especially enjoyed beating bookmakers, while Paulie enjoyed making money by outsmarting anyone he could. Soon, Henry arranged a meeting involving Motzi, Perla, Jimmy, Paulie, and the Boston College players. Henry and the others traveled to Boston to meet Rick Kuhn and Jim Sweeney, the players who were supposed to manipulate the games. Before speaking with them, Henry searched the players for hidden microphones to make sure they weren't cooperating with the authorities. The players appeared nervous, but quickly became comfortable discussing the scheme. They were promised $2,500 for each manipulated game, and they were also interested in placing their own bets. Their goal was simple: don't lose the game, just control the margin of victory. Then came the first test. On December 6, Boston College played Providence. Boston College was favored by 7 points. Henry and Jimmy placed a small bet as a trial, while Henry watched the game from the stands. At first, everything seemed to be going perfectly, but then Henry realized something was going terribly wrong. Jim Sweeney was having an incredible game. He kept making shot after shot. Every basket pushed Boston College farther ahead, threatening to destroy Henry's bet. Henry sat there desperately wanting Sweeney to miss, but he couldn't even react because he was sitting directly behind Sweeney's parents, who were cheering proudly for their son. Henry became increasingly frustrated. He believed Rick Kuhn was at least trying to help by making mistakes, throwing the ball away, committing a poorly timed foul, and allowing Providence opportunities to score. But Sweeney wouldn't stop scoring. Henry had entered the arena expecting to watch a carefully controlled basketball game that would make him money. Instead, he found himself cheering against the very players he had paid to manipulate the game, while sitting among their families. The first test of the scheme was turning into a disaster, largely because Sweeney simply couldn't stop making baskets. All they needed to win by was 7. They would have won the game, and I would have won the money. Instead, they won by 19 points, 83-64. Some scheme, a waste. They took a perfectly good no-lose deal and threw it away. It was ridiculous. If we had bet big money on the game, we would have been dead. I didn't want to go near the kids. I talked to Perla and Motzi and said I was pissed, and Jimmy was going to be even more upset. We were serious people. If the kids wanted to shave points, fine. It was business. But if they didn't, then let's forget the whole thing. No hard feelings, just goodbye. I told them, don't screw around, you can't play ball with broken fingers. Later, Kuhn said that just before the Providence game, he had gone over to Sweeney to tell him the spread was 7, but Sweeney didn't say anything. During the game, when Sweeney began scoring, Kuhn said he asked Sweeney what he was doing. Sweeney said he was playing to win. Kuhn said that after the game, he had told Sweeney he was crazy, that he had just blown $2,500. We had a Harvard game coming up that weekend, and I told Perla it was her second chance, but I was going to need some assurances. Kuhn said he'd already recruited Ernie Cobb, the team's best player, into the deal. It was a lock. At the December 16th Harvard game, everything was perfect. We only bet about $25,000 on it because of the Providence disaster. We bet on Harvard. Our bet was that Boston couldn't beat Harvard by more than the 12-point spread. This time the players did well. They threw away dozens of shots to keep the winning score low. Boston wound up winning by only 3 points, and we cleaned up. Then, on December 23rd, we got bold and bet more than $50,000 on a UCLA game, where the guys were the big underdog. That time we bet that Boston would get beaten by more than the 15-point spread. Again, the guys did fine. They managed to lose by 22 points, and I began to think that the thing might really work. We were riding high. The next game, against Fordham, on February 3rd, we had trouble laying off enough bets in New York, and we sent Modsey to Las Vegas to bet $55,000 with the bookmakers. This tune we were betting on the underdog, Fordham. We bet that Boston could not beat them by the 13-point spread, since Boston was the easy favorite. It was just a matter of how much our guys decided to win by. It should have been beautiful. We should have cleaned up, except that just before the end of the game we got a call from Paul Modsey. He said that he had been driving into Vegas from the airport with the money for our bet when he got into some kind of traffic jam, and by the time he got to town he was too late to get the bet down. Guys got killed for missing the window on winning bets. But Modsey was smart enough to call before the game was over to make sure we didn't think he was holding out on us. We should have made a couple $100,000, but we wound up holding nothing. It was an omen. We got some money down on the next game, February 6th, against St. John's, but that turned out to be a push or a game where the point spread balances itself out and nobody wins and nobody loses. We let the money ride on the next game, February 10th, which was against Holy Cross. In that game, Holy Cross was a favorite, and all our guys had to do was make sure they were beaten by at least 7 points. We, of course, bet Holy Cross to win by the 7-point spread. It was our big money game. We bet with both arms. The bookies already had our money from the push game the week before, and we dumped even more green on top of that. I was at Jimmy's watching the game on television. It was a party. Everything was going as you'd expect. Holy Cross was winning all through the game, but toward the end our guys seemed to get all fired up. It looked as though they didn't want to lose by too much. Pretty soon, before anyone even realized it, they had come within a few points of the lead. As the clock began the final countdown, our guys tried to pull back, but by then the Holy Cross players went cold. Our guys are just standing there, but Holy Cross couldn't hit from anywhere on the court. Then the other Boston College players, the ones who weren't on our scheme, started scoring from all over. They must have smelled an upset. It was awful. Of course, Holy Cross finally won, but they only won by 3 points instead of the 7-point spread, and Jimmy and I went down the tubes. Jimmy went nuts. He was furious. He put his foot through his own television set. I know he lost about $50,000 all by himself. I finally got Pearl on the phone, and he said that he had talked to Kuhn right after the game, and that Kuhn had said they just couldn't bring themselves to lose by too much against Holy Cross. That was it. No more. The end of the point-shaving scheme. Jimmy was so mad at losing the cash that he said he wanted to shake those kids up. At one point during the night, he said, "Let's go up to Boston and put their heads through hoops." But we never went anywhere. By then, Jimmy had bigger problems than money. After the disastrous Providence game, Henry warned the players that the basketball scheme was serious business. If they were going to participate, they had to follow the plan. Otherwise, Henry wanted nothing to do with them. The players got another chance against Harvard on December 16th. This time, everything went exactly as planned. Boston College was favored by 12 points, but the players deliberately missed shots and kept the score close. Boston College won by only 3 points, allowing Henry and his associates to make a large profit. Encouraged by their success, they took an even bigger risk against UCLA on December 23rd. Boston College was the underdog, and the gamblers bet that Boston College would lose by more than the 15-point spread. The players followed the plan, losing by 22 points. Henry began to believe they had a reliable money-making operation. Then came the Fordham game. They planned to bet heavily, about $55,000 through Modsey in Las Vegas. But Modsey got stuck in traffic after arriving at the airport and reached the bookmakers too late. The bet was never placed. It was a huge missed opportunity. The next game against St. John's ended in a push, meaning nobody won or lost. The money was carried over to their next major bet against Holy Cross. This time, they bet heavily. Henry and Jimmy watched the game on television, confident that the players would follow their instructions. Holy Cross was supposed to win by at least 7 points. At first, everything looked perfect. Holy Cross led throughout most of the game. But near the end, the Boston College players suddenly started fighting back. They closed the gap instead of allowing Holy Cross to win comfortably. Henry and Jimmy watched in horror as the point spread disappeared. Holy Cross eventually won, but by only 3 points. The gamblers lost everything. Jimmy Burke completely lost his temper, furious over losing around $50,000. He kicked his own television set and wanted revenge against the players. When Henry spoke to Perla, he learned that Kuhn had admitted the players simply couldn't bring themselves to lose by a large margin against Holy Cross. That was the end of the scheme. After several successful games, missed opportunities, and one devastating loss, Henry realized that the players couldn't always be trusted to follow the plan. Jimmy was furious enough to talk about going to Boston and hurting them, but they never went. By then, however, Jimmy Burke had much bigger problems waiting for him. Chapter 16, The Lufthansa Heist. Only 2 months after leaving prison, Henry Hill heard about what would become one of the biggest scores of his life. Lufthansa. The information came from his bookmaker friend Marty Krugman. During a visit to Henry and Karen's new house, Marty secretly pulled Henry aside and told him about a huge amount of cash sitting inside the Lufthansa cargo facilities at Kennedy Airport. The money came from American currency returned from West Germany. Millions of dollars in untraceable $50 and $100 bills were sometimes stored overnight at the airport before being transported to banks. Marty's source was Louis Werner, a Lufthansa cargo supervisor who was drowning in gambling debts. Werner owed Marty around $20,000 and was desperate for money. Unlike ordinary airport informants, however, Werner didn't just provide a tip. He had already thought through the entire robbery. He knew the airport security system, the timing of the cash deliveries, where the robbers should park, and how many men would be needed. For Henry, the opportunity was irresistible. Cash was the perfect target. Unlike stolen jewelry or other valuables, cash didn't need to be sold, altered, or passed through a fence. It could simply be spent. Henry immediately began thinking about who could carry out the robbery. The timing seemed almost perfect. Jimmy Burke and Tommy DeSimone were both about to return to New York from prison. Jimmy would be living at a halfway house in Manhattan, giving him freedom to move around the city. Henry imagined the Lufthansa robbery becoming even bigger than their famous $480,000 Air France robbery from 1967. There was, however, one major obstacle. Jimmy Burke hated Marty Krugman. Jimmy had never trusted Marty. He believed Marty was making money from his bookmaking business without properly paying tribute to the people who controlled the neighborhood. Jimmy had even pressured Henry to extort money from Marty. The tension eventually became serious enough that Jimmy had Tommy DeSimone and Danny Rizzo beat up one of Marty's employees as a warning. Marty refused to submit and even threatened to go to the district attorney. So Henry knew mentioning Marty's name could ruin the entire plan. Still, Henry knew Jimmy couldn't resist the money. When Henry finally explained the Lufthansa opportunity, he emphasized the enormous amount of cash involved before revealing that Marty was the source. As expected, Jimmy immediately became interested. He still didn't want anything to do with Marty personally, but the money was too tempting to ignore. After thinking about it for a week, Jimmy finally gave Henry his answer: bring Marty to Roberts. The Lufthansa robbery was about to move from rumor into a real plan. Jimmy Burke finally agreed to hear the full plan from Marty Krugman. At the bar, Marty explained everything while Jimmy mostly sat quietly, smiling and listening. But Henry noticed something unusual. Jimmy barely spoke. Instead of becoming deeply involved himself, Jimmy kept his distance and simply told Henry to get the phone number of Lou Werner, the Lufthansa insider. Jimmy still didn't trust Marty. From that moment, Jimmy began running the entire robbery from Robert's bar, which became his unofficial headquarters. He first asked Joe Buddha Manry to examine Werner's plan. Joe came back excited, saying the plan was so large that they might need 2 trucks just to transport the stolen money. By November, Jimmy had assembled the crew. Several men were chosen to enter the Lufthansa facility with weapons, including Tommy DeSimone, Joe Buda, Angelo Sepe, Anthony Rodriguez, Fat Louis Caffra, and Paolo Lee Castri. Another associate, Stax Edwards, was responsible for getting rid of the vehicles afterward. There were other people involved, but Henry deliberately avoided asking questions. In their world, knowing too much could be dangerous. By early December, everything was ready. The crew was simply waiting for Werner to confirm that the Lufthansa cash had arrived. Jimmy also arranged shares for important people connected to the airport, including Paul Vario's son Peter and Vinny Acero of the Bonanno family, because maintaining relationships with the people controlling the airport was essential. The crew began counting down to the robbery. Then, early Monday morning, December 11th, 1978, the plan finally became reality. At 3:12 a.m., Lufthansa security guard Kerry Whalen noticed a black Ford Econoline van near the cargo terminal. He approached it to investigate. Suddenly, one of the masked robbers struck him in the head with the barrel of a .45 pistol. Whalen was hit again. Blood began pouring from his forehead. Another gunman grabbed his weapon and disarmed him. The robbers then forced him to deactivate a silent alarm, something that immediately made Whalen realize these men knew the airport security procedures. They handcuffed him and surrounded him with armed, masked men. One robber took Whalen's wallet and threatened him, claiming they knew where his family lived and could send people to his home if he refused to cooperate. Bleeding and unable to see clearly, Whalen had little choice. He agreed to cooperate. The Lufthansa robbery was officially underway. A few minutes after the robbery began, another Lufthansa employee, Rolf Redman, heard suspicious noises and opened a door to investigate. Immediately, a group of masked gunmen rushed inside, forced him against the wall, and handcuffed him. Using the special magnetic keys taken from the first guard, the robbers moved through the building with remarkable confidence. They seemed to know the layout, the employees, and the security procedures almost perfectly. They gathered more employees and took them to a third-floor cafeteria, where several workers were eating during the night shift. The robbers already knew the employees' names. They forced everyone onto the floor and demanded that John Murray, the senior cargo agent, contact Rudy Eyrich, the night supervisor. Eyrich was crucial because he was the only employee on duty who possessed the keys and combinations needed to open the highly secured Lufthansa vault. Murray tricked Eyrich into coming to the cafeteria by claiming there was a problem with the shipment. When Eyrich arrived, he immediately saw the situation. His co-workers were lying on the floor, restrained and gagged. He understood that resistance would be dangerous. The robbers took Eyrich downstairs toward the vault. What shocked him was how much they already knew. They understood the double-door security system, the silent alarms, and even warned Eyrich not to touch certain parts of the vault. Eyrich opened the first massive vault door. The robbers knew the procedure. The outer door had to be closed before the inner vault could be opened. Otherwise, a silent alarm would alert the authorities. Once inside, the robbers searched through hundreds of packages. They had apparently brought copies of documents or manifests to help identify exactly which packages contained the valuable shipments. Then they began throwing packages toward the outer vault. One package landed near Eyrich's head. A robber smashed it open with his boot, revealing what appeared to be neatly packed stacks of cash. The robbers continued working quickly. They moved at least 40 packages from the inner vault to the outer vault, then carefully locked the inner door before opening the outer one. 2 men carried the packages outside and loaded them into the waiting van, while the others returned Eyrich to the cafeteria. There, the employees were restrained again. But then something went wrong. One of the robbers rushed into the cafeteria, sweating heavily. He had removed his ski mask and was wiping his face. Another robber immediately shouted at him, "Put the mask back on." But it was too late. Several employees had already seen his face. The robbers then gave the terrified employees one final order. Don't call the police until 4:30 a.m. The cafeteria clock read 4:16 a.m., but the employees didn't wait. Exactly 14 minutes later, the first call reached the Port Authority police. By then, the robbers were gone. They had stolen approximately $5 million in cash $875, $000 worth of jewelry. The entire operation had taken only 64 minutes. It became the most successful cash robbery in American history at the time. And despite the careful planning, one small mistake, the exposed face of one robber, will become a major problem for the crew. Chapter 17. The Beginning of the End. The Lufthansa robbery was supposed to be the crew's greatest achievement. They had stolen around $5 million in cash and $875,000 worth of jewelry, almost $6 million altogether. But instead of bringing them happiness and wealth, the robbery became the beginning of the end. Henry did not know about the robbery. Henry was completely unaware that the robbery was happening that night. He was busy trying to keep his basketball point shaving operation going. That night, he had been drinking with Marty Krugman at the Spice of Life in Cedarhurst, less than 2 miles from the airport. He had no idea that Jimmy and the crew were carrying out the biggest robbery of their lives. The next morning, Henry woke up, turned on the radio, and heard the news about the Lufthansa robbery. The authorities were giving different estimates of how much money had been stolen, but everyone knew it was a massive robbery. Henry leaves Karen. The night before, Henry had argued with Karen. He became angry, packed his clothes, and took the Long Island train to the apartment of a woman he knew in Manhattan. Meanwhile, Karen was looking for him and did not know where he was. Jimmy calls Henry. Around 10 in the morning, Jimmy Burke called Henry and asked him to meet at the Stage Delicatessen. When Henry arrived, he saw Jimmy Burke Tommy de Simone Fat Louis Caffra. They were all in a good mood. Lufthansa was all over the television and radio, but nobody openly talked about the robbery. Jimmy was being careful. Jimmy asked Henry whether he was going home to Karen that night. This was important. Jimmy wanted everything to look normal. He didn't want the wives to become suspicious because their husbands were suddenly disappearing or behaving strangely after robbery. Jimmy even asked Henry if he needed money. Then Jimmy pulled out an envelope containing around $10,000 in $50 and $100 bills and gave Tommy and Fat Louie about $500 each. The following morning, Henry met Jimmy again. They were still working on their basketball point shaving scheme, including the upcoming Harvard game. So the crew was now involved in 2 major criminal operations at the same time. The Lufthansa robbery, the basketball point shaving operation, the moment Henry found out. While Henry and Jimmy were driving toward the tunnel, Jimmy suddenly let go of the steering wheel and grabbed Henry around the shoulders. He said, "We got it. We got it." Then he immediately returned to driving as if he had said nothing. Henry understood exactly what Jimmy meant. They had successfully robbed Lufthansa. And this was the beginning of what would become one of the most infamous episodes in their criminal history. The important point. The irony is that Lufthansa was supposed to be the crew's greatest success, but it became the beginning of their downfall. The enormous amount of money created greed, suspicion, fear, and eventually violence. The people involved would begin making mistakes, and the robbery would ultimately bring devastating consequences for crew. This section shows just how quickly the Lufthansa robbery turned from a huge success into a deadly situation. Henry realizes Jimmy wants to kill Marty. While Henry and Jimmy were driving, Jimmy casually asked, "Do you think Marty told his wife Fran about Lufthansa?" That question immediately scared Henry. Henry knew Jimmy extremely well. He understood that Jimmy was worried Marty might have told his wife about the robbery. Henry immediately realized Jimmy was thinking about killing Marty Krugman. Henry tries to save Marty. Jimmy told Henry to call Marty and arrange a meeting. Henry tried to make it sound as though Marty probably talked to many people, and that there was nothing unusual about him knowing about Lufthansa. Henry was deliberately trying to convince Jimmy, Marty isn't a serious threat. Don't kill him. But Jimmy wasn't interested. He told Henry to find a way to get Marty somewhere alone later that night. Tommy is brought into the plan. Henry called Marty and arranged to meet him at the 40 yards. When Henry returned to the table, Tommy DeSimone was there. Jimmy then told Henry to work with Tommy and figure out where they would take Marty that night. Tommy suggested the Riviera Motel. His plan was simple. Henry would drive Marty to the back parking lot. Henry would tell Marty he had to meet some women. Henry would leave Marty there. Tommy and Angelo Sepe would take care of the rest. In other words, They planned to murder Marty. Henry understood how quickly a person's life could be in danger in their world. Henry tries to change Jimmy's mind. Henry still had several hours before the planned killing. During the drive to meet Marty, Henry repeatedly tried to convince Jimmy not to do it. He pointed out that Marty's wife, Fran, would become suspicious and cause problems if Marty disappeared. He also reminded Jimmy that Marty was useful to them because he helped them place their bets. Henry's real argument was, killing Marty would hurt their own business. Jimmy changes his mind. When they arrived at the 40 yards, Marty was waiting. Just before entering, Jimmy suddenly told Henry, "Forget about tonight." Henry was relieved. Jimmy then spent the afternoon drinking and joking with Marty as if they were old friends. There was no discussion about Lufthansa, no discussion about the money. Henry began to think that Marty might actually be safe. Then Marty asked about his money. After Jimmy left, Marty asked Henry, "When do I get my money?" Henry told him to ask Jimmy. Marty said he already had. According to Marty, Jimmy had told him that his share was $500,000. At that moment, Henry understood something important. Jimmy had a financial reason to want Marty dead. If Marty disappeared, Jimmy could potentially keep Marty's $500,000 share. Marty doesn't realize the danger. Marty then asked Henry how much money Henry was getting. Henry tried to avoid answering, but Marty kept insisting that Henry should receive his fair share. He even offered to give Henry $150,000 and then convinced Jimmy to give Henry another $150,000. Marty genuinely believed he was helping Henry. He had absolutely no idea that, only hours earlier, Jimmy had been discussing having him killed. Henry couldn't tell Marty what was happening because Marty probably wouldn't have believed him. The Christmas party. 3 days after the robbery, the crew held a Christmas party at Roberts. Almost everyone important was there. Paulie, Jimmy, Berklenny, Tommy Fat, Louie. The only major person missing was Tommy DeSimone, because Paulie did not like having Tommy around. This is an important turning point because the crew is celebrating what should have been their greatest success. But underneath the celebration, paranoia, greed, and fear are already beginning to destroy them. This section shows how the Lufthansa robbery starts destroying the crew from the inside. The biggest problems are carelessness, greed, surveillance, and murder. Stax Edwards makes a fatal joke. At the Christmas party at Roberts, everyone was eating and drinking. Henry pulled out a large amount of cash to pay for something. Stax Edwards saw the money and started joking about how the Mafia guys supposedly had all the money from the airport robbery. Stax was saying, essentially, "How come I'm broke while you Mafia guys have all those millions?" The joke was extremely dangerous because the people who actually committed Lufthansa were sitting right there. Stax had made a huge mistake. Stax had been responsible for getting rid of the van used in the robbery. He was supposed to take it to someone in New Jersey who would destroy it and remove the evidence. Instead, Stax got high and abandoned the van on a street in Canarsie, only about a mile and a half from JFK Airport. The police found it the next day. Even worse, the van contained evidence. Fingerprint ski massa, leather jaqueta, Puma sneaker footprint. Stax should have been terrified and hiding. Instead, he was sitting in Roberts joking about the Lufthansa robbery. Paulie realizes the danger. Lenny Vario, Paulie's brother, joined Stax in joking about the robbery. Lenny didn't actually know that his own brother and the people around him had been involved. Henry looked at Paulie and noticed that Paulie was unhappy. Jimmy was watching Paulie's reaction carefully. Henry understood what was happening. Stax had basically signed his own death warrant. Jimmy gave the order. But Henry believed that Paulie's reaction was what pushed Jimmy toward a decision. Stax is murdered. That weekend, Tommy DeSimone and Angelo Sepe went to Stax's home. Stax was still in bed. They killed him quickly, shooting him 6 times in the head. The crew then created a cover story. When Marty heard about Stax's death, he assumed Stax had been killed because of some unrelated drug or financial problem. The crew maintained that story publicly. Henry even spent Christmas Eve with Stax's family at the funeral home and told them that Jimmy and Tommy couldn't attend because they had to be at the halfway house. Marty becomes the next problem. After Stax's murder, Henry knew that Marty Krugman could be next. Marty was constantly demanding his share of the Lufthansa money. He was also heavily in debt to loan sharks, about $40,000, and needed money to pay the interest. He kept asking, "Where's my money?" Henry repeatedly told him to calm down and that he would eventually receive his share. But Marty wouldn't stop. The pressure gets worse. By January, Marty was constantly hanging around Roberts. At the same time, law enforcement surveillance was increasing. There were cars watching the bar around the clock, and federal agents were nearby. The situation was becoming extremely dangerous. Henry wanted Marty to disappear from the area, but Marty simply wouldn't listen. Jimmy gives Henry some money. Henry says he didn't even ask Jimmy for his share. Jimmy invited him to his house and opened a bread box in the kitchen. Inside were stacks of cash. Henry estimated around $100,000. Jimmy gave Henry $10,000. Henry gave Karen $3,000 for Christmas shopping and kept $7,000 for himself. He then bought a $300 artificial Christmas tree, which was apparently the most expensive tree at the store. Despite everything happening around them, Henry's children had a great Christmas. Jimmy's Florida plan. The week after Christmas, Jimmy sent Henry to Florida with a shipment of bad cocaine. Jimmy had paid $250,000 for it. He wanted to recover his money from the person who had sold him the bad drugs. But Jimmy didn't just want his money back. He intended to kill the seller. He planned to confront him at the Green Lantern Lounge in Fort Lauderdale. This shows how increasingly violent and unstable Jimmy had become. Tommy DeSimone is finally going to be made. Tommy was supposed to be formally made into the Mafia. For Tommy, this was a huge deal. Being made meant becoming an officially recognized member of the Mafia. Henry compares it to being baptized. Tommy had been waiting for this moment for years. He had reportedly been scheduled to have Bruno Facciolo and Pete Vario vouch for him. But then the ceremony was postponed because of heavy snow. The next day, Jimmy called again to find out whether the ceremony was happening. Henry watched Jimmy talking on the phone. Suddenly, Jimmy slammed the phone down with tremendous force. The booth shook. Jimmy came out with tears in his eyes. Henry asked what had happened. Jimmy told him. They just whacked Tommy. Tommy had been murdered. Why was Tommy killed? The Gotti crew, associated with the Gambino family, had killed Tommy. The reason went back to Billy Batts and another man known as Foxy. They were made members of the Gambino family. Tommy had killed them without authorization. Normally, killing a made mafia member without permission was a serious violation. Eventually, the Gambino people discovered evidence that Tommy was responsible. They held a meeting with Paulie and obtained his approval to kill Tommy. So Tommy's dream of becoming a made man ended with his murder. The bigger meaning. This section is where the story becomes much darker. The Lufthansa robbery created a chain reaction. Lufthansa robbery, evidence left behind, Stax gets killed, increasing police surveillance, Marty demands his money, paranoia grows, Tommy kills people without permission, Gambino retaliation, Tommy gets murdered. The crew had made millions, but instead of becoming richer and safer, they were becoming increasingly desperate, paranoid, and violent. The Lufthansa robbery was supposed to be the crew's greatest success, but quickly became the beginning of its downfall. After the robbery, Henry learned that Jimmy Burke was becoming increasingly suspicious of anyone who might know too much. Jimmy considered killing Marty Krugman because Marty knew about the Lufthansa score and was demanding his share of the money. Henry tried to protect Marty by convincing Jimmy that killing him would create unnecessary problems, especially because Marty was useful for placing bets. The situation became even more dangerous when Stax Edwards joked openly about the Mafia making millions from the airport robbery. Jimmy interpreted this as a serious risk. Soon afterward, Stax was murdered. Then Tommy DeSimone disappeared. He had been expecting to be formally inducted into the Mafia, but the ceremony was actually a trap. The Gambino organization had discovered that Tommy had killed made men without authorization, including Billy Batts, and had received approval to have Tommy killed. Finally, Marty Krugman was murdered on January 6th. His wife, Fran, immediately suspected that something terrible had happened. Henry knew the truth, but had to pretend that he knew nothing about the robbery or Marty's disappearance. The chapter shows how the Lufthansa robbery transformed the crew from successful criminals into a group surrounded by paranoia, surveillance, betrayal, and murder. What began as a massive payday became the event that started destroying everyone involved. Chapter 18 Summary. The Lufthansa robbery became a huge media sensation, but behind the publicity, law enforcement launched an enormous investigation. More than 100 FBI agents were assigned to the case within the first 48 hours. The FBI, Port Authority Police, NYPD, Customs, Lufthansa Security, insurance investigators, and Brinks all began searching for evidence and questioning witnesses. The prosecutor leading the case, Edward A. McDonald, quickly became convinced that Jimmy Burke and the crew from Robert's Lounge were responsible. Informants independently identified Burke as a mastermind, while witnesses identified photographs resembling several suspected gunmen, including Tommy DeSimone and Angelo Sepe. However, investigators still lacked enough admissible evidence to make arrests, so they began an extensive surveillance operation. The FBI and police followed Burke, DeSimone, Sepe, and Anthony Rodriguez around the clock. They used surveillance cars and van spotter planes and helicopters to uncover officers' electronic bugs tracking devices' informants. They even planted listening devices in Jimmy's Oldsmobile, Tommy's Lincoln, and Sepe's new Thunderbird. But the crew knew they were being watched. For nearly 8 weeks, it became a battle of nerves. Jimmy and the others continued their normal routines while constantly trying to lose their surveillance. They used aggressive driving tactics, unexpected U-turns, running red lights, reversing onto highway ramps, and even drove into restricted airspace around JFK to escape FBI aircraft. The listening devices were also largely useless because whenever Jimmy, Angelo, or Tommy entered their cars, they turned the radios up to full volume. Main point. This chapter marks the beginning of the serious law enforcement pressure surrounding the Lufthansa robbery. The crew knew they were suspects, while investigators knew they believed was responsible, but knowing and proving were two very different things. The FBI continued monitoring the crew, but Jimmy Burke and his associates were extremely careful. Even when investigators managed to capture fragments of conversation, the recordings were too vague to prove involvement in the Lufthansa robbery. For example, Angelo Sepe was recorded making suspicious comments about a brown case in a bag from Lufthansa and discussing money hidden somewhere. But none of this was enough to establish a criminal connection. Meanwhile, the gang became so skilled at evading surveillance that members sometimes disappeared for days and turned up as far away as Florida. Prosecutor Edward McDonald could have violated their parole and sent some of them back to prison, but that wouldn't solve the real problem: finding the stolen money and proving who committed the robbery. The investigation turns toward an inside man. McDonald was convinced that Lufthansa had been an inside job. The robbers had known far too much. Which warehouse contained the millions of dollars, which employees were working that night, the names of the employees, how the security system worked, where the special magnetic key was located, how the vault doors operated, how to avoid triggering the alarms. Someone inside Lufthansa had clearly provided detailed information that led investigators directly to Lou Werner, the Lufthansa cargo supervisor, who had originally supplied Marty Krugman with information about the money. Werner immediately became a major suspect. Investigators discovered that, shortly before the robbery, Werner had interfered with the normal Brinks pickup. He claimed that additional approval was required before the money could be collected. He then disappeared for about an hour and a half, and the Brinks guards eventually left without taking the Lufthansa money. That meant Werner had effectively ensured that the millions of dollars would remain inside the airport over the weekend. Werner starts talking. Unlike Jimmy Burke and the experienced criminals, Werner couldn't keep his mouth shut. He began telling people that he was about to come into a lot of money. He paid off gambling debts and loan sharks and announced plans to spend Christmas in Miami. Even worse, Werner had apparently told people about the robbery before it happened. He told his estranged wife that he was going to receive a huge amount of money. He also told his friend William Fischetti about the upcoming robbery and promised to invest $30,000 of the proceeds in Fischetti's taxi business. Then Werner's personal life became chaotic. He discovered that Fischetti was having an affair with his estranged wife, Beverly. Furious, Werner withdrew from the business arrangement. On the morning of the robbery, Werner even called Fischetti and cryptically said, "See, Big Mouth." A few days later, Werner bragged to his girlfriend Janet Barbieri about the robbery. She immediately panicked, crying and telling him that he would end up in prison. Werner then went to his local bar and, after supposedly making the bartender promise to keep quiet, told him the entire story. The key contrast. The investigators were discovering an important distinction. Burke and the professional criminals knew how to stay silent. Werner did not. The FBI had struggled to get usable evidence from the experienced members of the crew, but Werner was leaving a trail of statements, suspicious behavior, and financial activity everywhere he went. This made Werner the weak link, the amateur whose loose mouth could eventually lead investigators back to Jimmy Burke and the Lufthansa crew. The FBI quickly realized that Lou Werner was surrounded by people who were willing to talk. Nearly everyone who knew him eventually provided information. One of the most important witnesses was William Fischetti, who cooperated with the FBI because he was afraid his wife would discover his affair with Werner's estranged wife, Beverly. For weeks, agents met Fischetti in coffee shops and taxicabs, where he revealed extensive information about the robbery. According to Fischetti, Werner and another Lufthansa employee, Peter Grunewald, had planned the robbery months in advance. They had previously been involved in stealing $22,000 in foreign currency and concluded that stealing such a relatively small amount wasn't worth the risk. If they were going to steal from a vault, they wanted to steal millions. Werner and Grunewald developed a detailed plan and then searched for criminals capable of carrying it out. Grunewald initially tried to recruit a local tough guy, but eventually abandoned him because he didn't consider him reliable enough. When Grunewald failed to find suitable robbers, Werner approached his bookmaker, Frank Mena, looking for someone who could execute the robbery. This ultimately helped investigators connect the inside operation to the professional criminals. Grunewald becomes a witness. The FBI initially questioned Grunewald, but he denied knowing anything about the robbery. Investigators, however, found the man Grunewald had previously approached, and Fischetti was also willing to testify against him. Then, 9 weeks after Lufthansa, agents discovered that Grunewald had obtained a standby airline ticket from New York through Bogota and onward to Taiwan and Japan. He claimed he was going to visit his estranged wife. The FBI arrested him as a material witness. Facing the possibility of serious consequences, Grunewald eventually decided to cooperate with prosecutor Edward MacDonald and help build a case against Werner. The case starts coming together. MacDonald now had testimony from several people: Peter, Grunewald, William, Fischetti, Beverly, Werner, Janet, Barbieri, Frank Mena. Together, their testimony gave MacDonald enough evidence to charge Lou Werner with participating in the Lufthansa robbery. Investigators also had enough evidence against Angelo Sepe to obtain a search warrant for his girlfriend Hope Barron's property in Mattituck, Long Island. The FBI suspected that part of the stolen Lufthansa money had been buried somewhere on the property, based partly on suspicious conversations they had recorded while surveilling Sepe. Werner refuses to break. MacDonald's larger objective wasn't simply to prosecute Werner. He wanted Werner to cooperate with the government and identify the professional criminals who had actually carried out the robbery. But Werner surprised everyone. Before his arrest, he had talked constantly and bragged about his involvement. Once he was in custody, he completely stopped talking. After hours of interrogation, Werner continued denying any involvement. He claimed that all his previous statements about the robbery had simply been lies designed to make himself appear more important. The turning point. The investigation is now moving from suspicion to actual evidence. The FBI has begun connecting Werner, Grunewald, Mena, Sepe, Burke's crew. But proving the entire chain will require more than informants and suspicious behavior. The investigators need physical evidence, witnesses, and ultimately someone willing to testify against the people who planned and executed the robbery. MacDonald decided to force a confrontation between Lou Werner and Peter Grunewald. Werner was brought into a conference room at the Strike Force office. Then MacDonald walked in with Grunewald. Werner immediately understood what had happened. Grunewald had cooperated with the government. Werner began trembling so badly that MacDonald feared he might suffer a heart attack. Grunewald tried to persuade his old friend to cooperate, telling him that the government already knew what had happened and that Werner would be better off helping them. Grunewald suggested that cooperation could potentially lead to a much lighter sentence, especially if Werner helped identify the robbers and recover the stolen money. But Werner refused. He continued to claim that he knew nothing about the robbery and insisted that if McDonald believed he was guilty, the government would have to prove it in court. The investigation hits a wall. At this point, Werner was essentially McDonald's strongest case. The surveillance of Jimmy Burke and the others had confirmed the FBI's suspicions, but it hadn't produced enough usable evidence to charge them with the Lufthansa robbery. The search of Hope Barron's property also failed to uncover the stolen money. On May 23rd, after holding Angelo Sepe for 35 days, McDonald was forced to drop the charges because there wasn't enough evidence to obtain an indictment. This created a major problem. The government could potentially send Burke and others back to prison for parole violations, but doing so might destroy the opportunity to catch them making a mistake or revealing where the Lufthansa money had gone. Then the bodies started appearing. Even more disturbing was the growing number of murders and disappearances connected to people around the Lufthansa crew. Stax Edwards. 1 week after the robbery, on December 18th, police found Stax Edwards dead in his Ozone Park apartment. He had been shot 6 times in the chest and head. There were no signs of forced entry or a struggle, and the apartment had apparently been cleaned of fingerprints. Money and jewelry were left behind, ruling out an ordinary robbery. The circumstances suggested that Edwards knew his killers and wasn't expecting an attack. Tommy DeSimone. On January 14th, Tommy DeSimone's wife reported him missing. At first, police wondered whether Tommy had simply disappeared because he knew investigators were looking for him after witnesses identified his photograph as resembling one of the Lufthansa gunmen. But rumors soon spread that Tommy had been killed. Richard Eaton. 3 days later, police discovered the body of Richard Eaton, a 42-year-old con man and hustler, inside an abandoned refrigeration truck in Brooklyn. His hands and legs had been bound with wire, and his neck had been broken. The body was so frozen that identification took more than 2 days. Eventually, police discovered Jimmy Burke's name and telephone number among Eaton's belongings. Investigators learned that Eaton had occasionally worked as a courier and frontman for Burke. The Florida Money Trail. Police also learned that Eaton had recently returned from Florida, where he was allegedly supposed to help launder large amounts of money. This caught McDonald's attention because FBI surveillance had already captured Angelo Sepe discussing money and a trip to Florida. Investigators retraced Eaton's movements and searched a safe deposit box where they had been told he had placed millions of dollars. The box was empty. The bigger picture. The investigation was becoming increasingly disturbing. The FBI knew who they suspected. They knew there was an inside man. They suspected the stolen money was being moved and hidden. But witnesses were disappearing, suspects were being murdered, and physical evidence kept vanishing. The Lufthansa robbery was no longer just a massive theft. It was becoming a criminal conspiracy surrounded by intimidation, disappearances, and killings, making the government's case increasingly difficult to prove. The investigation took an even darker turn as more people connected to the Lufthansa robbery began disappearing or turning up dead. Marty Krugman disappears. Fran Krugman reported her husband Marty Krugman missing. He had last contacted her on January 6th, saying he wouldn't be home for a while. McDonald eventually discovered that Frank Mena had sent Lou Werner's robbery proposal to Marty Krugman. Krugman was therefore one of the few known links connecting Werner's inside information to the criminal organization. But by the time McDonald realized how important Krugman was, Marty had disappeared and was presumed dead. This was a major blow to the investigation because McDonald desperately wanted to know who Krugman had passed Werner's information to. Teresa Ferrara disappears. 2 weeks later, Teresa Ferrara, a 27-year-old beautician, received an urgent phone call and rushed to a nearby diner. Before leaving, she told her cousin that she had an opportunity to make $10,000. She left behind her purse, keys, and coat. She never returned. Investigators discovered that Ferrara had previously lived in the same house as Tommy DeSimone, strengthening the connection between her disappearance and the criminal network surrounding Lufthansa. Months later, a woman's torso was discovered in the waters off New Jersey. X-rays confirmed that it was Teresa Ferrara. Werner finally goes to trial. By the time Lou Werner's trial began, 5 potential witnesses had either been murdered or had disappeared. Because of the danger, McDonald placed the surviving witnesses under round-the-clock protection. The prosecution presented several important witnesses. Peter Grindelwald testified that he and Werner had developed a robbery plan together. The barroom criminal whom Grindelwald had initially approached testified about the plan and said Werner was the source of security information. Janet Barbieri, Werner's girlfriend, reluctantly testified that Werner had bragged about his involvement. After a 10-day trial, Werner was found guilty on May 16th of helping plan and execute the Lufthansa robbery. He was the only person actually charged with the robbery. He faced up to 25 years in prison. Werner's last chance. MacDonald now hoped that Werner would finally cooperate. If Werner talked, he could potentially identify the professional criminals who had used his information. But MacDonald didn't yet know the whole story. Werner had actually dealt directly with only one member of Jimmy Burke's crew, Joe Buddha Manry. Jimmy had sent Manry to evaluate Werner's robbery plan. Manry had met with Werner near Kennedy Airport and had apparently left $85,000 for him. So if Werner had cooperated, he could have directly implicated Manry. Then came the devastating development. Joe, Buddha, and Frenchie are murdered. After Werner's conviction, he was placed in protective custody at the federal prison. Jimmy Burke was also being held there after being arrested for violating parole. That same night, police discovered Joe, Buddha, Manry, and Robert Frenchie McMahon dead inside a Buick in Brooklyn. Both men had been shot once in the back of the head with a .44 caliber weapon. Manry's death was especially significant. He was the only member of Burke's crew whom Werner could directly identify as having dealt with him. With Manry dead, Werner's potential cooperation had suddenly become far less useful to the government. The pattern was becoming unmistakable. People who knew too much were disappearing or being killed before they could testify. Chapter 19, Summary. Henry describes the extreme pressure he was under before his arrest. He was working long hours, heavily using cocaine, dealing drugs with Bobby Germain, and tried to keep everything hidden from Paulie Vario. At the same time, Jimmy Burke had gone underground after the Lufthansa robbery, leaving Henry with fewer opportunities to make money. Henry was also dealing with problems involving guns, the Boston College basketball point-shaving scheme, his girlfriend Robin, and his friend Bill Arrico, who was in prison. The FBI had already searched Henry's house for weapons. During the search, Karen secretly hid a 9mm pistol in her underwear. On the morning Henry was finally arrested, he was transporting guns that Jimmy had ordered. Henry was supposed to stop at Jimmy's house before picking up his brother from the hospital. On the way, he noticed a red helicopter apparently following him, which made him suspicious. When Henry reached Jimmy's house, Jimmy immediately inspected the guns. But after seeing them, Jimmy became angry because the guns were incompatible with his silencers. Henry suddenly realized Jimmy probably wasn't going to pay him for them, leaving Henry stuck with the cost. The chapter sets up Henry's increasingly chaotic life. Drugs, guns, gambling, police surveillance, criminal associates, and growing pressure from law enforcement, all of which are closing in on him. Henry explains that Jimmy Burke had become increasingly unstable after the Lufthansa robbery. He had known Jimmy for more than 20 years, but the killings connected to the robbery convinced him that Jimmy had become obsessed with the Lufthansa money. Jimmy even once described the money as cursed. Henry believed Jimmy saw anyone asking for their share as someone trying to steal from him. Because of that, Henry decided not to argue when Jimmy rejected the guns. Henry then drove toward the hospital to pick up his brother, still carrying the guns in his trunk. He was speeding when he noticed the same red helicopter following him. Moments later, he nearly crashed into a massive traffic pileup on the Long Island Expressway. He managed to stop just before hitting the wreckage. After picking up his brother, Henry saw the helicopter again. He became convinced that federal agents were following him, possibly because of the guns. Back home, Henry prepared a large Italian dinner while continuing to watch for the helicopter. He was also planning to meet Bobby Germain to give him the guns Jimmy had rejected, collect money, and obtain heroin for one of his couriers, Judy Wicks, who was supposed to transport drugs to Pittsburgh. When Henry and Karen left the house, the helicopter appeared again, this time extremely close. Henry became worried about leading the surveillance team to Germain's hideout while carrying Jimmy's guns. He stopped at his mother's house, used the carport's cover, and hid the guns in her garbage cans. Feeling safer without the weapons in his car, Henry decided to try to shake the helicopter. His solution was simple. He told Karen, "Let's go shopping," and they drove to a large shopping mall, hoping to lose whoever was following them. Henry spends a couple of hours at the shopping mall to shake the surveillance. He calls Bobby Germain from a payphone and warns him that he is being followed by a helicopter. Bobby thinks Henry is simply paranoid. By around 4 p.m., the helicopter is gone. Henry and Karen return to his mother's house, retrieve the guns, and take a long, deliberately confusing route to Germain's apartment. Henry watches for suspicious cars and license plates along the way, trying to determine whether he is still being followed. When they finally reach Germain's place, Henry feels relieved. He uses more cocaine to calm himself down, and Germain gives him the heroin package that is supposed to be transported to Pittsburgh by Judy Wicks. Henry then contacts Judy and tells her about the upcoming flight. He specifically orders her to make the necessary calls from a payphone, not from his house. Judy ignores him and uses Henry's home telephone to arrange her Pittsburgh flight and contact Paul Matzi. Henry immediately realizes the danger. The authorities can now know the package is leaving his house, who is carrying it, the destination, and the flight information. Yet Henry doesn't realize just how closely the police are already watching him. He returns home and continues preparing dinner. He asks Judy whether she really made the calls from outside. She claims she did, so Henry doesn't cancel the operation. Later, Henry takes the heroin to Robin's house to cut it with quinine. Instead of leaving quickly, he gets dragged into another argument with Robin about their relationship. He eventually escapes and returns home. After dinner, Judy suddenly insists on going home to get her lucky blue and pink hat before her 11 p.m. flight. Henry is exhausted and annoyed, but agrees to drive her. Before leaving, Henry realizes he is still carrying about half a kilo of heroin in his pocket. He decides not to take it with him and hides the packages inside a recessed light near the entrance of the house. Then, almost immediately after driving away, his car is surrounded by police vehicles. A man in a windbreaker approaches and puts a gun against Henry's head, ordering him not to move. For a moment, Henry believes he is about to be murdered because of Lufthansa, but then he realizes something that strangely reassures him. They're cops. Henry knows that gangsters would simply kill him without warning. The fact that the man is shouting and identifying himself tells Henry that he is being arrested, not executed. This is the moment Henry's increasingly chaotic criminal life finally catches up with him. Chapter 20. Summary. The chapter opens with Nassau County Narcotics Detective Daniel Mann learning about Henry Hill. At first, Mann assumes Hill is just another suburban drug dealer. He has dealt with dozens of similar cases and doesn't want to get excited until he has solid evidence. The investigation begins with a 19-year-old drug dealer who is arrested for selling Quaaludes to undercover officers. Instead of waiting for the police to pressure him, the teenager immediately offers to cooperate in exchange for leniency. He claims he can provide information about something much bigger than his own drug dealing, an organized heroin and cocaine operation connected to the Mafia, operating from Long Island and distributing drugs across the United States. Mann contacts another detective who already knows the informant. His response is essentially that the kid is legitimate and worth listening to. The informant's information. The teenager tells Mann and Assistant District Attorney William Broder that the drug operation is connected to the Lucchese crime family. Paul Vario is connected to the operation. Henry Hill is one of its leaders. Hill is closely associated with Jimmy Burke. Hill had previously been involved in airport hijackings. The informant believes Hill may also have been involved in the Lufthansa robbery. He has personally visited Hill's home and knows Hill's family. The investigators are particularly interested because getting evidence against Paul Vario is extremely difficult. Many people who could potentially testify against him have disappeared or been killed before law enforcement could reach them. Hill's drug operation. The informant says he first discovered Hill's involvement in drugs in 1979, shortly after Hill was released from prison. The teenager had been doing landscaping work at Hill's house. While waiting for someone to pick him up, Hill allegedly offered him a job as a drug courier or mule. Hill then took him into a secured bedroom inside the house. The room had an electronically operated door, and inside Hill showed him a large quantity of cocaine. According to the informant, Hill claimed he was moving approximately 8 kilograms of cocaine per week and needed additional couriers. Hill allegedly offered the teenager $5,000 per trip to transport cocaine to different locations around the United States. The important shift. This chapter marks a major turning point in the story. Until now, Henry has mainly been portrayed through his involvement in robberies, gambling schemes, and the Lufthansa operation. Now the authorities are beginning to build a narcotics case against him, and unlike the Lufthansa investigation, they have something extremely valuable, an insider who is willing to cooperate. The informant doesn't merely know Henry by reputation. He claims to have been inside Henry's house, seen the cocaine, and personally been offered work as a courier. That gives Detective Mann a much more direct path toward building a case against Henry and eventually the wider organization. Detective Daniel Mann began building a serious case against Henry Hill after a young drug dealer agreed to become a confidential informant. The informant claimed that Hill was running a large-scale heroin and cocaine operation connected to Paul Vario and the Lucchese crime family. Because Hill was extremely cautious and difficult to follow, Mann obtained a 30-day wiretap order for Hill's home and another apartment allegedly used to process and distribute drugs. Over the investigation, detectives collected 35 reels of recorded conversations, along with surveillance photographs. What surprised the investigators was that Hill wasn't simply a drug dealer. He seemed to have connections across virtually every level of organized crime. He was connected to drug trafficking, bookmaking, loan sharking, jewelry, fencing truck, hijacking, labor, racketeering, criminal associates throughout New York high-level mob figures. Normally, mob members stayed within their particular criminal specialty and rarely interacted directly with higher-ranking figures. Hill was different. He appeared to move freely between different groups and levels of the criminal organization. The investigation expanded dramatically. Detectives began collecting Hill's garbage and discovered flight schedules, coded calculations, and notes that appeared to correspond to drug shipments and couriers. They also discovered that one of Hill's Pittsburgh distributors operated a dog grooming business as a front. For more than 2 months, investigators followed Hill almost everywhere, using cars, bakery trucks, and even helicopters. They documented his meetings, conversations, associates, and movements. The investigation had become much larger than the police initially expected. Henry Hill was no longer simply a suburban drug dealer. They had stumbled onto someone whose connections appeared to reach deep into New York's organized crime network. The strongest part of the case against Henry Hill came from 2 months of legally authorized wiretaps. Detective Daniel Mann believed the recordings revealed enough information to connect Hill and his associates to extensive criminal activity. Mann explained that experienced criminals eventually make mistakes on the telephone. Even careful mobsters could become careless because using a phone becomes routine. According to Mann, major organized crime figures such as Paul Vario and Carlo Gambino understood the danger and avoided having telephones in their homes. Vario reportedly relied on an intermediary to receive messages. The problem for less cautious criminals was that ordinary conversations could gradually become incriminating. People would talk about everyday matters for hours, eventually forgetting that their conversations could be recorded and used as evidence. The criminals also tried to protect themselves by using code words. In Hill's case, they reportedly used words such as opals to refer to drugs. They would discuss how much money the opals should be bought or sold for. But coded conversations weren't necessarily effective. Prosecutors could bring in experts to interpret the terminology and establish that the supposed gemstone transactions made no economic sense. By March 1980, Mann and the Nassau County Narcotics Squad had accumulated enough recordings from Hill's Rockville Center telephone to prepare a report for the court seeking an extension of the wiretap. The investigators were about to use Hill's own conversations as the central evidence against him. The wiretap investigation had now given investigators a much clearer picture of Henry Hill's operation. According to Detective Mann's affidavit, Hill appeared to be at the top level, possibly the leader of a large interstate drug trafficking network. Investigators believe the operation was centered around 2 locations in Rockville Center, Hill's home and Robin Cooperman's apartment, which was referred to in coded conversations as the Batcave. The investigators had identified numerous people communicating with Hill and his associates, although many identities and roles remained unknown. The drug code. Hill's group tried to avoid directly mentioning drugs. Instead, they used strange terms such as opals, stones, buds, carrots, OZ, whole quarter, half, 1 for 2. The investigators concluded that these weren't really conversations about jewelry or ordinary merchandise. The prices, quantities, and context made apparent that the terms were being used as code for drug transactions. One particularly bizarre conversation involved Hill and Paul Motze, his Pittsburgh distributor. They talk about golf clubs, dogs, shampoo, and dog pills. To an ordinary listener, the conversation made little sense, but investigators interpreted it as a coded discussion about drugs, payment, and delivery. The arrests. By the time Mann and the prosecutors were ready to move, they had accumulated enough information to arrest Henry Hill and 13 other members of the operation. Among those arrested were Robert Genova, a pornography film producer who drove a Rolls-Royce, Paul Motze, Hill's Pittsburgh distributor, Frank Basile, the son of Philly Basile, Bobby Germain, Hill's drug partner and a fugitive wanted in connection with major jewelry robbery. The arrest of Germain produced an extraordinary discovery. Germain insisted that the police had arrested the wrong person. He claimed to be a freelance writer and even showed investigators a manuscript he supposedly was writing, but his fingerprints told the truth. The man known as Bobby in the wiretaps was actually Robert Germain Sr., and he was the father of the 19-year-old confidential informant who had started the entire investigation. The young informant had originally cooperated with police to save himself from drug charges. He had identified Henry Hill and ultimately ended up implicating his own father, Robin's kitchen. The investigators also searched Robin Cooperman's apartment and found something surprisingly damaging: ordinary kitchen utensils containing traces of drugs. They recovered spoons, sieves, mixing bowls, scales, and strainers. Investigators believe these items have been used to mix and process drugs. Hill had repeatedly warned Robin to clean the utensils after preparing the drugs. He had even bought her a dishwasher, but Robin apparently didn't bother cleaning properly. The result was almost absurd. Evidence that could help send Hill to prison was sitting in his girlfriend's kitchen because she wouldn't wash the dishes. That became one of the most ironic details in the entire investigation. Chapter 21. Henry becomes a prize catch. For Assistant U.S. Attorney McDonald in the strike force, Henry Hill was extremely valuable. Henry wasn't a high-ranking mafia boss, but he had something prosecutors wanted even more: knowledge. He had spent decades around organized crime and had learned how the street-level operations actually worked. McDonald quickly realized that the drug case could be used to get much bigger targets. Within a day, he began working with Nassau prosecutors to transfer the case to the federal government. Henry, meanwhile, still believed he could manipulate the situation. He offered information about hijackings, murders, and the Lufthansa robbery, hoping to use his knowledge as leverage, but he never fully committed to cooperating. He would suggest that he might talk, then deny having said it. The narration makes the point that Henry was essentially running out of options without realizing it yet. Karen's perspective. Karen described what happened at the Hill house after Henry's arrest. 2 detectives arrived with a search warrant. She didn't initially know Henry and the others had been arrested, so she wasn't particularly frightened. She even offered the detectives coffee. She believed that being polite and cooperating was smarter than insulting the police. The detectives searched practically everything: closets, drawers, kitchen cabinets, suitcases, clothing, pockets, other areas of the house. Eventually, Karen learned that Henry had been arrested on drug charges. At first, she thought the case might be beatable because investigators had found drug residue at Robin's apartment, but apparently hadn't found drugs at the Hill home. Then Henry gave her a subtle signal during court. Because they had been married for 17 years, Karen immediately understood what he meant. The drugs were hidden inside the house. She went home after court, retrieved roughly a pound of heroin, and destroyed the evidence. Karen therefore believed the prosecution had lost its strongest physical evidence. Something was wrong. Henry was being held on $150,000 bail. He told Karen that he wanted to remain in jail for a couple of weeks so he could get off drugs and clear his head. But Karen noticed that something wasn't right. Henry was nervous. Jimmy Burke and Mickey Burke were behaving strangely. Even Henry's lawyer, Richie Otto, was confused because Henry had apparently avoided meeting with him for several days. Then Lenny Vario spoke to Karen and told her that Henry was a stand-up guy who would never testify against certain people. The message was clear. Henry was expected to keep his mouth shut. Mickey Burke continued calling Karen every day, asking when Henry would be released. Karen understood that Mickey wasn't simply asking for herself. Jimmy wanted to know what Henry was going to do. Then Jimmy called Karen and told her to pick up some material for the T-shirt operation from his shop on Liberty Avenue. She was already rushing to court for one of Henry's appearances, but Jimmy insisted that she stop by anyway. This is where the pressure surrounding Henry and the fear that he might cooperate with the authorities begins to intensify. Karen went to Jimmy's shop expecting to pick up some material. Jimmy acted casually, smiling and asking whether she needed anything. But when she walked down the street toward the store, something immediately felt wrong. The windows of the stores along the block had been painted over. Jimmy remained outside and repeatedly gestured for her to enter one particular store. Inside was a man Karen recognized from Jimmy's circle. She had previously seen him painting Jimmy's house, but she suspected he was actually one of Jimmy's enforcers. Karen became suspicious and decided not to enter. She told Jimmy she was late for court, got into her car, and left. At the time, she didn't realize how significant the encounter might have been. Paulie turns his back on Henry. The following day, Karen went to see Paulie Vario. Paulie was furious with Henry. He reminded Karen that he had previously warned Henry about getting involved with drugs. Paulie had made it clear that if Henry got arrested because of narcotics, he would not use his influence to help him. Normally, Henry could have expected Paulie's influence to make obtaining bail much easier. But this time, Paulie refused to intervene. Then Paulie told Karen something even more serious. He was going to have to turn his back on Henry. He gave Karen $3,000, placing the money in her hand without even counting it. As he turned away, Karen saw that Paulie was crying. It shows how complicated the relationship had become. Paulie was abandoning Henry professionally, but there was still an emotional connection between them. MacDonald returns to Lufthansa. The narrative then switches back to Assistant U.S. Attorney Ed MacDonald. For MacDonald, Henry Hill's arrest represented the first major breakthrough in the Lufthansa investigation in more than a year. After Lou Werner's conviction, the Lufthansa case had essentially stalled because potential witnesses and participants were disappearing or being murdered. Among those who disappeared or were killed were Joe Manry and Frenchie McMahon, murdered on the night Werner was convicted; Paolo Lee Castri, whose body was later found on top of a burning garbage pile in Brooklyn; Louis Caffra and his new wife Joanna, who disappeared after leaving a relative's home in Queens in a new Cadillac. The pattern was becoming impossible for investigators to ignore. Anyone who knew too much about Lufthansa seemed to be in danger, and now they had Henry Hill, a man who potentially knew far more than any previous witness. Henry Hill had reached the most dangerous point of his life. He was one of the few survivors of the Lufthansa crew, but now he was trapped between prison and death. He was facing 25 years to life for the Nassau County drug conspiracy. His girlfriend, and even his wife, could also be pulled into the case. But prison was not his only problem. Henry knew that going back onto the streets could be even more dangerous. Jimmy Burke no longer trusted him, and Paul Vario had largely turned his back on him. Informants were telling the authorities that Henry might be the next man to be killed. The FBI began putting pressure on him. Agents visited him repeatedly in jail. His parole officer warned him about returning to the streets, and FBI agents even showed him photographs of men who had disappeared or been murdered after the Lufthansa robbery. Henry understood the message, but he wasn't ready to betray his crew completely. Shortly after his arrest, he asked whether he could make a deal. He offered to become a man on the street, someone who could provide information without officially becoming an informant or testifying in court. The authorities wanted much more. So a psychological game began. In front of prisoners and guards, Henry loudly insisted that he would never talk and accused the authorities of trying to get him killed. But once the door closed and he was alone with the investigators, his attitude changed. He would calm down and give them small pieces of information. Henry was buying time. His plan was to clear his head, reduce his bail, get back onto the streets, and then decide what to do. Maybe he would disappear. Maybe he could repair his relationship with Paul Vario. Maybe he could find another way to survive. But he understood one terrifying reality. If the crew decided that Henry was more dangerous alive than dead, they would kill him. The drug case made everything worse. Paul Vario had strictly forbidden his men from getting involved with drugs, not because he was morally opposed to them, but because he knew drug cases could lead to enormous prison sentences. Henry remembered what had happened to Carmine Tremonti, who received 15 years in prison over a drug case and eventually died behind bars. Now, Henry was facing the same kind of danger. He was also using large amounts of cocaine and quaaludes, and everyone knew it. Jimmy Burke even believed that the drugs were destroying Henry's mind. Henry was trapped from every direction. The police wanted him to talk. His crew feared that he would talk, and the courts were preparing to send him away for decades. For the first time, Henry began to realize that staying alive might require him to betray the very people he had spent his entire life with. Henry Hill had always considered himself a stand-up guy. He had served prison time without informing on anyone, and he believed that his loyalty and past reputation should have meant something. But now he realized that none of it mattered. In the mob, what you did yesterday didn't protect you today. From Jimmy Burke's perspective, Henry had become a liability. He was involved in drugs, facing a long prison sentence, and, most importantly, was now under enormous pressure from the authorities. Henry didn't even need the FBI to convince him that his life was in danger. He already suspected Jimmy, wanted him gone. Then the FBI played him a recording of Sepe and Stabil discussing getting rid of him. Sepe called Henry a junkie and wanted the problem dealt with quickly. Jimmy, however, remained calm and simply told him not to worry about it. That calmness frightened Henry more than anything. He stayed in jail because he needed time to think. Every day, Jimmy or Mickey would call Karen and ask when Henry was getting out. Karen would visit Henry and tell him what they had said. Henry understood something terrifying about the mob. People don't usually warn you that they're going to kill you. The people who come for you may be your friends, the same people who have loved and trusted you for years. They come smiling, pretending to help, and they wait until you're at your weakest. But Henry still struggled to believe that Jimmy would actually kill him. Jimmy had been his mentor and protector. He had introduced Henry to cigarette bootlegging and hijacking. They had buried bodies together and carried out crimes such as Air France and Lufthansa. They had gone to prison together, attended family events together, and shared years of friendship. Now Henry had to consider the possibility that the man who had taught him everything might be the man who would kill him. His paranoia had become so extreme that, shortly before his arrest, Karen had convinced him to see a psychiatrist. Henry couldn't tell the doctor the truth, but he admitted that he was afraid people were going to kill him. The doctor simply advised him to get a phone answering machine. Inside jail, Henry's decision slowly became clear. He wasn't just asking himself whether he should cooperate with the authorities. He was figuring out how to cooperate, while still protecting the money and drugs he had left outside. He had approximately $18,000 worth of heroin hidden where police hadn't found it. $20,000 owed to him by Paul Mazzi, around $40,000 in loan shark money still on the streets. Additional money owed to him by fences and people involved in jewelry robberies and gun deals. Henry wanted to collect as much as possible before completely cutting himself off from his old life. So even his decision to cooperate became another hustle. Every time federal agents came to question him, Henry would scream at them and pretend he wanted nothing to do with them. Sometimes he refused to leave his cell. He wanted the other prisoners, and especially people connected to Jimmy, to believe that he wasn't cooperating. But underneath the performance, Henry was terrified. Men connected to Jimmy's crew were coming in and out of the prison on work release, carrying information about who was talking and who wasn't. Henry knew that if Jimmy discovered what he was secretly planning, he could be killed even inside the prison. When McDonald told him that jail was the safest place for him, Henry didn't believe it. He believed Jimmy had enough influence to walk into the prison, get a weapon, kill him, and walk out. Henry, therefore, devised another part of his strategy. Whenever the authorities took him to McDonald's office, he demanded that Bobby Germain be brought along too. That way, Henry could make a loud public performance, insulting his lawyer, complaining about harassment, and pretending that he was furious about being questioned. To everyone watching, Henry looked like a man who wanted nothing to do with the government. But privately, he was preparing for the biggest decision of his life. He was getting ready to turn on the people who had once been his family. Henry continued his dangerous game with the federal agents. He deliberately made sure that his screaming and complaints about harassment were heard by people connected to Jimmy and Paulie. He wanted them to believe he was refusing to cooperate. But once his lawyer left, Henry would spend hours in McDonald's office, drinking coffee while the investigators tried to persuade him. He never gave them a definite answer. He didn't say yes, and he didn't say no. He simply kept them waiting. Henry knew that eventually he would probably have to cooperate. The problem was that he was almost as afraid of trusting the federal agents as he was of Jimmy Burke. It wasn't because he thought the FBI would intentionally betray him. He was afraid they were too careless and incompetent. He had already seen them make mistakes in his drug case, including accidentally revealing the identity of an informant in court documents. Henry didn't want government mistakes to get him killed. The escape from jail. After 18 days in jail, Henry decided the time had come to make his move. Late Saturday night, Karen and her mother arrived with $10,000 in cash for bail. Henry deliberately chose a weekend because the federal agents and his parole officer would be away, giving him time to disappear, collect some money, and determine whether the threats against him were real. As he walked out of jail, Henry was terrified. He moved quickly to the car, convinced that someone might be waiting outside to kill him. He didn't feel safe until he reached home. Then Karen gave him terrible news. She had flushed the $18,000 worth of heroin that had been hidden in the house. Henry exploded. He had only signaled her to hide the drugs if the police returned with dogs. He had never told her to destroy them. Karen began crying and screaming, and soon they were both shouting at each other until they were exhausted. That night, Henry slept with a gun beside him. Jimmy wants to see him. The next morning, Mickey called Karen to find out how Henry was doing. When she told her that Henry was already home, Mickey was shocked. She asked why nobody had told her. She said Jimmy could have helped with the bail money. But that was exactly why Henry had kept everything secret. He didn't want Jimmy or anyone connected to him to know when he was leaving jail. Then Mickey delivered the message. Jimmy wanted to see Henry immediately. Henry wasn't ready. He told Karen to say there was too much police attention and that they were going to a bar mitzvah that night. He would meet Jimmy the following morning. Henry needed Saturday to collect money and, more importantly, watch for signs that Jimmy was preparing to kill him. The meeting at the diner. On Sunday morning, Henry went to the Sherwood Diner on Rockaway Boulevard. He arrived early. Jimmy was already there, sitting in a booth at the end of the restaurant. From there, he could see everyone entering the diner and anyone pulling into the parking lot. It was obvious what Jimmy was doing. He was checking whether Henry had been followed. Something else immediately caught Henry's attention. Jimmy hadn't touched his food. Normally, Jimmy would have eaten an enormous breakfast. Eggs, sausage, home fries, crullers, English muffins, and plenty of ketchup. But that morning, the food sat untouched. Jimmy was nervous. He kept taking his glasses off and putting them back on. He looked restless and tense. Henry felt terrible. Jail, fear, paranoia, and exhaustion had taken everything out of him. Even after showering, changing his clothes, and putting on cologne, he still felt as though he could smell the jail. Then Jimmy stood up. He smiled. He opened his arms and moved toward Henry for a big bear hug. For a moment, it felt like the old days. Two old friends sitting together in their familiar diner. But Henry knew things had changed. The court papers lying across the table showed that Jimmy had been following the case closely. And underneath the friendly smile and embrace was a question Henry could not escape. Was Jimmy there to welcome his old friend home, or to find out whether Henry was about to betray him? Henry Hill had reached a point where his past loyalty meant nothing. He had spent years proving himself to Jimmy Burke and the crew, but now he was a liability. He was facing a long prison sentence for the drug case, and worse, he suspected that his own friends were considering killing him before he could cooperate with the government. The FBI eventually showed Henry evidence that Sepe and Stabil were discussing getting rid of him, but Henry already suspected Jimmy. He understood that in their world, murder did not necessarily come with threats or arguments. It could come disguised as friendship, with a smile and an offer to help. Henry decided that his only chance was to play both sides. He pretended to resist the government while secretly considering a deal. He wanted to get out of jail, collect as much of his hidden money and drugs as possible, and then decide how to survive. He had thousands of dollars scattered throughout the criminal network, and he was determined not to leave it behind. After 18 days, Henry arranged bail and walked out of jail with Karen. He was terrified that someone would kill him the moment he left. At home, he discovered that Karen had flushed a large stash of heroin down the toilet after misunderstanding his signal. Furious and frightened, Henry spent the night sleeping with a gun. The next morning, he met Jimmy at a diner. They acted as if everything were normal, but both men knew what was really happening. Jimmy was trying to determine whether Henry had talked to the authorities, while Henry was trying to determine whether Jimmy intended to kill him. Then Jimmy suggested that Henry go to Florida with Anthony Staybill to kill Bobby Germain's son, the informant who had helped start the investigation. Henry immediately understood the trap. Staybill was one of the men suspected of wanting Henry dead. If Henry went to Florida with him, he suspected he would never return. Henry pretended to agree while secretly preparing his escape. He arranged untraceable rental cars, gave Karen a gun, and began collecting whatever money he could. His plan was to stay alive long enough to secure his money and figure out his next move, but the plan collapsed quickly. As Henry returned home later that day, 8 federal agents surrounded him. The authorities had discovered that he was out on bail, and Assistant U.S. Attorney McDonald was no longer willing to take chances. Equals 22 equals Karen. As soon as they pick him up, the kids and I went to the FBI office in Queens. We had FBI men and federal marshals all around us. My mother, who was going crazy by now, came along. I went into Ed McDonald's office, and he said that we all had to go into the witness program. He explained that we were all in danger. Henry, me, the kids. He said that the only chance we had was for Henry to cooperate. We had to start a new life. I asked, what if I let Henry go into the witness program and the kids and I stayed at home? McDonald said we would still be in danger because they might try to get to Henry through me and the kids. McDonald made it plain. He had federal marshals with him. They all explained. They said that when Henry appeared in court, the people he was testifying against would be looking for us. Henry was the only thing that stood between those people being free and spending the rest of their lives in jail. If they thought my parents or my sisters knew where we were, their lives wouldn't be worth 2 cents. They would make them tell where we were, and then we would be killed. Then McDonald started his little blackmail. He said that there was enough evidence to indict me in the narcotics case. He said that we would all be on trial, and he asked what I thought the effect of that might have on the kids. I was pretty much in a daze, but when I walked out of his office, I knew I was going into the program. Henry had told McDonald he would cooperate if I agreed to go into the program with him. He said he wasn't going in alone. I had no choice. They're going to prosecute my husband and me. How could you look after the kids? McDonald asked me. They made it impossible for me to make any other decision. The minute I walked out of McDonald's office, Henry grabbed me and said I had to stay with him. He didn't want to go into the program alone. He wasn't going to go without me. My mother had been waiting outside McDonald's office with the kids. She was very upset. She wanted Henry to go into the program alone. I said, what other choice did I have if my life was in jeopardy? They could kidnap me and the kids just to get to Henry. She started yelling about Henry, how he had never been any good, how he had brought all this upon us. McDonald had said that they would pack me and the kids right then. They'd take me home under guard and pack me. We would be gone. It meant leaving everything immediately. My mother, my father, my sisters. I couldn't believe how fast it was all happening. We wouldn't be able to even contact them again, ever. It was like a death. My mother and I and the kids were driven home by the marshals. When we got home, there were marshals inside the house and out. They had 4 cars. They had shotguns and rifles. I had to pack enough stuff for 2 or 3 weeks, or until they could move us into another place. My father and sisters were waiting at the house. They all helped me pack. We were all packing and crying. When they were not looking, I whispered to my mother that she should give us some time. We'd get in touch. My father was very good. He held together. The kids were excited. All they knew was that we were going away. They thought of it all like a vacation. I said that was more than that. We had to go away so that some people who wanted to hurt us couldn't get to us. I said that they could not call any of their friends, and they couldn't go back to school and get their books or sneakers or gym clothes. The kids had read the papers. They knew about all the people who had been killed. There were stories every week about Jimmy and Polly. They knew about Stax and Marty Krugman. They knew Tommy had disappeared. They could see that everything we had was falling apart. Remember, there had been about a year of craziness between Lufthansa and their father's arrest. I made up a long list of things for my mother to do. There was still stuff at the dry cleaners. I had bills to pay. My mother cleaned out the refrigerator. There were pictures of a party we'd had. When my mother called about the pictures, the word was out that Henry had turned, and the photographer, who was a friend of Raymond Montemuro's, didn't want to give her the pictures. She said if he didn't give her the pictures, she'd send over the marshals. He said, okay, but when she went and picked them up, he threw them at her. He wouldn't even take the money. We had packed up everything in large black garbage bags. The kids and I were driven by marshals. There were 4 or 5 marshal cars all around us. They took us to a motel in Riverhead. It was a very nice, clean place. They moved us every couple of days. They always had the reservations made, and we went right to our rooms. The marshal just gave us the keys, but they always stayed outside the door. They stood around with walkie-talkies and rifles and slings under their raincoats. Chapter 22, Story Style Summary. The moment Henry was arrested again, everything changed for Karen and the children. They were taken to the FBI office in Queens, where federal agents and marshals surrounded them. Assistant U.S. Attorney Ed McDonald told Karen bluntly that Henry's cooperation was their only real chance of survival. If Henry testified against the people he had worked with, those men would have powerful reasons to find him, and they could reach him through his family. Karen asked whether Henry could enter the witness protection program alone, while she and the children stayed home. McDonald made it clear that this would not keep them safe. He warned that the people Henry testified against could threaten, kidnap, or harm his family to discover where Henry was hiding. Then the pressure became even more direct. McDonald told Karen that the government had enough evidence to potentially charge her in the narcotics case. He asked her what would happen to the children if both she and Henry ended up on trial. Karen realized she had almost no choice. Henry himself had already made his condition clear. He would cooperate only if Karen and the children went into the witness protection program with him. He refused to disappear without them. When Karen left McDonald's office, Henry immediately grabbed her and told her he needed her with him. Outside, her mother was furious. She blamed Henry for destroying the family's life and wanted him to enter the program alone. But Karen understood that staying behind could put everyone in danger. There was no time to prepare emotionally. The marshals told them they had to leave almost immediately. Karen returned home with the children under heavy federal protection. Marshals surrounded the house with several vehicles, weapons, and radios. She was told to pack only what they needed for a few weeks. Her parents and sisters were there, helping her pack while everyone cried. For Karen, it felt less like moving and more like a death. She was leaving behind her parents, sisters, home, possessions, and entire identity. She could not even say goodbye properly. The children initially thought they were going on vacation. Karen had to explain that they were leaving because dangerous people wanted to hurt them. They could not return to school, collect their belongings, or even freely contact their friends. They already understood more than she wished they did. They had seen the newspaper stories about the murders surrounding Henry's former associates. They knew about the people who had disappeared or been killed, and they could see their family's world collapsing. Even the smallest pieces of their old life had to be abandoned. Karen's mother tried to collect bills, belongings, dry cleaning, and family photographs. When she went to retrieve photographs from a party, the photographer, afraid because of Henry's cooperation with the government, refused to give them back until she threatened to send the marshals. Finally, everything they could take was stuffed into large black garbage bags. Karen and the children were driven away under heavy federal escort. They were taken to a motel in Riverhead, where marshals kept watch outside their room with radios and weapons. They would stay in one place only briefly before being moved again. Henry had chosen to turn against the mob, but the price of that decision was enormous. His entire family had to disappear and leave their old lives behind forever. For the next several weeks, Karen and the children lived like ghosts. The marshals kept moving them between places as far away as Connecticut and Montauk. Every morning, they were driven under protection to FBI headquarters in Queens or the strike force offices in Brooklyn. While Henry sat with investigators discussing his former life and the crimes he knew about, Karen waited with the children, doing needlepoint while they played or read. Behind the scenes, the government was erasing their old identities and rebuilding new ones. The family was asked to choose new names. Their old records were being destroyed or sealed, and they were issued new Social Security numbers and identification documents. Even the children's school records had to be carefully reconstructed. Their academic history would remain, but their previous school information would disappear from the documents sent to their new school. The marshals even arranged to privately explain the situation to the new school's principal, making the family sound as though they were connected to some highly sensitive government operation. Despite the terrifying circumstances, Karen remembered the marshals positively. They treated her and the children with respect, talked and joked with them, and even played cards with the kids. Their kindness helped make the impossible situation slightly easier. After a couple weeks, Karen returned to their old home in Rockville Center for the last time. Marshals were everywhere, and moving trucks were waiting to take their belongings away. Her parents were there too. But Karen still hadn't fully accepted that she was saying goodbye to her old life. Surprisingly, part of her began to see the witness program as an opportunity. For years, her mother had been extremely controlling, constantly telling her what to do. Karen had always felt suffocated by it, even though she knew her mother acted out of love. Now, with a completely new identity and a new life ahead, Karen imagined finally becoming independent. She began to believe that perhaps starting over wasn't entirely terrible. There would be no more Jimmy, no more drugs, and no more dangerous people from their old world. Henry could finally live an ordinary life. Come home at night, spend time with his family, make normal friends, and leave the criminal world behind. For Karen, the witness program represented something almost unimaginable, a chance to erase the past and start again from nothing. On May 27, 1980, Henry Hill officially sealed his deal with the U.S. Department of Justice. The agreement was straightforward but enormous in its consequences. Henry would tell the government everything he knew about James Burke, Angelo Sepe, the Lufthansa robbery, and their other criminal activities. If called upon, he would testify before federal grand juries and at trial. In return, the government agreed not to prosecute Henry federally for his involvement in the Lufthansa robbery or the Nassau County narcotics investigation, provided he fully cooperated. If another authority tried to prosecute him, federal prosecutors would recommend leniency because of his cooperation. Most importantly, the government agreed to place Henry, Karen, and their children into the Federal Witness Protection Program. But there was one condition that could destroy the entire agreement. Henry had to tell the complete truth. He had to immediately and fully disclose everything he knew. If he lied, withheld important information, refused to testify, or violated the agreement, the government could cancel the deal and use his statement against him. He could even face prosecution for perjury. Henry was therefore trading his entire criminal past for a chance to survive. But emotionally, leaving that world was much harder than simply signing a document. Henry admitted that despite everything, the drugs, murders, robberies, prison, and the threat that his own friends might kill him, he still loved the lifestyle. He remembered walking into places and instantly commanding attention. He and his crew were treated like celebrities. They had access to stolen goods, expensive clothes, jewelry, cars, apartments, drugs, gambling, and money. They didn't live like ordinary criminals trying to survive. They lived as though the world belonged to them. If they wanted something, they simply made a phone call. If they lost thousands gambling, they could make more money through another robbery. Lawyers, corrupt officials, and criminals were all part of the same system. In places like Las Vegas and Atlantic City, they were welcomed into expensive hotels, restaurants, shows, and private rooms. Everything was available to them, and now it was gone. Henry had escaped the life physically, but psychologically he was leaving behind everything that had made him feel powerful. He was no longer the man who could walk into a room and have everyone recognize him. He was no longer surrounded by money, stolen goods, criminals, and excitement. He was entering witness protection, where he would have a new name, a new identity, and an ordinary existence. And that was perhaps the strangest punishment of all. Henry had survived the mob, but he had lost the life he once loved. Epilogue, story-style summary. After everything collapsed, Henry Hill entered the Federal Witness Protection Program. He became one of thousands of criminals who chose to testify against their former associates rather than face prison or death. For the government, Henry proved to be an extraordinary witness. He had spent years around organized crime and had witnessed countless crimes, sometimes committing them so casually that he barely considered them crimes at all. During one conversation about the Lufthansa robbery, prosecutors discovered that Henry had also been involved in a Boston College basketball point-shaving scheme. To Henry, it was simply another part of business. Once he began cooperating, Henry became a powerful weapon for federal prosecutors. He testified against former associates and helped secure convictions in drug trafficking, gambling, organized crime, and murder cases. His testimony sent Paul Vario to prison and later helped convict Jimmy Burke for the murder of Richie Eaton. But the Lufthansa robbery, the crime that had started everything, remained largely unsolved. Almost everyone who could have connected Burke directly to the robbery had been murdered or disappeared. Henry and Jimmy were among the last major survivors who knew what had really happened. Henry's testimony eventually helped dismantle much of the world he had once belonged to. Men he had worked with for years became evidence against one another. The friendships, loyalty, and criminal brotherhood that had once defined his life were replaced by negotiations with prosecutors and deals for his own survival. The most dramatic moment came when Jimmy Burke was sentenced to life in prison for murder. Henry had survived a man he once considered his closest friend, and had helped the government put him away. Yet Henry's survival came at a price. He had betrayed virtually everyone from his former life. But unlike the other members of his crew, Henry was still alive. He and Karen were given new identities and relocated under witness protection. Their children attended private schools. They had a house and cars, and Henry even received a government salary for his continued cooperation. He was regularly escorted by armed federal marshals whenever he traveled. Ironically, the man who had once lived like a gangster king, surrounded by money, drugs, stolen goods, luxury cars, and powerful friends, was now living as an ordinary man under constant protection. And that was the final twist of Henry Hill's story. He lost the criminal world he loved, betrayed the people who had built that world with him, and survived by doing the one thing that world could never forgive, talking. In the end, Henry Hill didn't win because he was the strongest or the most loyal. He survived because when everything collapsed, he chose survival over loyalty.